Picture yourself in a small stone chamber, where the walls are cool to the touch, and the scent of damp earth hangs gently in the air. A single flame flickers in an iron sconce, casting long, wavering shadows across old wooden beams. Allow this quiet moment to melt into something older, something distant, into a time when the idea of bathing meant something very different, if it meant anything at all. Tonight, our story will drift along the slow and muddy stream of medieval bathing. There are no grand triumphs to chase, no complex puzzles to solve. Simply let this gentle tale become a quiet current, carrying your thoughts toward peaceful rest. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. It was a cold morning in late October when the bathhouse chimney finally coughed to life. You wouldn't have known it was lit by looking. The outside of the building looked no different than it did every other season. Weather-beaten wood, a sagging roof patched with straw, and a small sign painted with a symbol few in the village could read. But all understood. A wooden bucket, steam rising from it in 3 wavy lines. To the villagers of Ellenford, it meant only one thing. Today, the bathhouse was open. It wasn't open often. The firewood was too precious, the labor too demanding, and most days, it wasn't worth the trouble. People here didn't bathe unless they had to. A wedding, a death, a major festival, or the arrival of a distant cousin. And even then, they debated whether washing made them more vulnerable to chills, especially in the colder months. But twice a year, whether needed or not, the bathhouse was open to refresh the bones, as the old priest used to say. This was one of those times. The bathhouse sat beside the stream but wasn't fed directly by it. That would have made things too easy. Instead, it required a rotation of buckets, drawn by hand, poured into a great copper cauldron, then ladled out into smaller basins as they cooled. The water was boiled, yes, but never truly clean. No one boiled it to purify. They boiled it to warm it. Dirt was expected. Soap was optional. You didn't go to the bathhouse to get clean. You went to get less filthy. Inside the building, the smell was not pleasant. It wasn't foul exactly. It was just familiar. Steam, wet wood, old sweat, herbs, mildew, and the faint iron scent of water boiled in metal. The walls wept from the heat. Drops clung to the beams like morning dew. A low bench ran along 3 walls, its planks worn smooth by the backsides of generations. Beside the hearth, the great kettle hissed. There was no privacy. Modesty was a luxury reserved for nobility and clergy, and neither visited this place. Women bathed together, then men. Children came last. Each group waited outside until the one before had finished. Wrapped in wool cloaks or worn linen, their feet muddy and red from the cold. Once inside, they stripped, not hurriedly, but with practiced efficiency, as if removing a burden rather than clothing. The water was ladled into wooden tubs, cracked, darkened, steaming just enough to raise a sigh. But no one spoke much. Bathing was quiet, not because of shame, but because it required patience. You waited for your turn. You waited for the water to cool. You waited for your skin to stop bristling at the unfamiliar heat. There were no soaps in the way you might imagine. Sometimes a handful of ash was stirred into a basin. Sometimes lavender or thyme was added if the herbs were plentiful. Most often, there was nothing but water. If you wanted to scrape, you used a flat stone. If you wanted to scrub, You used last year's linen torn into a rag. Eye soap existed, made from animal fat and ash, but it was harsh, and few used it near their skin. More often, it was saved for laundering tunics or scrubbing wooden floors. The oldest woman in the village, Marit, was the unofficial keeper of the bathhouse. No one had named her. She simply showed up whenever the chimney was lit and settled herself on the bench nearest the cauldron. Her knees no longer bent well enough for the tubs, but her voice carried across steam like a chant. Back of the neck, she'd murmur. Behind the knees. Between the toes. She said it like scripture, and people listened. Even if they didn't always obey. To bathe in Ellenford was to undergo an awkward, necessary transformation. You didn't leave refreshed. You left red and drowsy, your skin tingling as it dried. The bath pulled the cold from your bones, yes, but it also left you exposed. It opened the pores, and in a world without reliable heat or medicine, that was dangerous. You bundled up fast when it was over. You didn't dawdle. Clothing, too, was not washed often. It was aired out, hung above fire smoke, laid over hedges in the sun. Full washing was laborious. Boiling water, pounding fabric against stones, stirring with sticks, drying for days. Most villagers had 2 sets of clothes, if they were lucky. One to wear, one to mend. The rich had more, of course, and servants to wash them. But the poor, they learned to live with their smell, and with everyone else's. You see, in Ellenford, and in most of medieval Europe, scent wasn't just tolerated, it was identity. People knew each other by it. The sourness of wool worn through harvest, the sharp edge of smoke-clung tunics, the mildew of old boots, the tang of salted meat and onion lingering on skin. It was all part of being alive. To smell of the world was to prove that you were part of it. Bathing then was not about removing odor. It was about resetting balance. Too much dirt made you ill. Too much washing made you weak. The goal was somewhere in between, where your skin still knew the sun, but your hands were soft enough to grip bread without leaving marks. Children splashed, of course. They found joy, even in the smallest of basins. But the adults bathed with care. Every movement was measured. Water was precious, and for all its association with purity, water could betray you. If it ran too long, it took your warmth with it. If it wasn't boiled well enough, it could bring fever. If it got into your ears, it could settle there and grow things. So, you listened to Marit. Rinse the hands, not the ears. Bring the cloth, not too close to the edge. Let the steam rise first. Then breathe it in. These weren't official teachings. They weren't in any book. But they kept the village well enough through cold seasons. And for centuries, that was more than most. Outside, the line thinned. The sun moved slightly behind the hills. A sheep bleated somewhere near the lower pasture. And inside the bathhouse, someone sighed. One of those long, slow exhales that only comes when the warmth has finally sunk deep into the back. You can imagine it, can't you? That moment when the water touches your ankles for the first time in weeks. The ache, the sting, the strange almost silence of your own heartbeat echoing against the wooden walls. It didn't last long. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. Then it was time to dress again. Time to return to the cold and the smoke and the daily rituals of survival. But for those few moments, the villagers of Ellenford were clean. Not in the modern sense, but in the way that mattered to them. And that raises a curious thought. If cleanliness was not about removal, but about ritual, did they ever feel cleaner than we do now? The warmth from the bath never lasted. By the time the villagers had walked home, half-dressed, cloaked in damp wool, their cheeks flushed with cold air and the fading sting of steam, the comfort had begun to retreat. Skin dried quickly in the wind. Fingers that had only just relaxed in warm water curled back into fists. Feet, still tender from soaking, slipped into stiff boots lined with straw. No one expected the clean feeling to endure. That wasn't the point. Cleanliness wasn't permanent in Ellenford. It was temporary, like a church bell, or sunrise, or a bowl of broth that burned your tongue before it warmed your belly. It was a thing to be savored while it lasted and forgotten once it was gone. In truth, no one in Ellenford knew exactly where the idea of clean came from. Not in the sense modern people might define it. There were no soaps with floral names, no scented oils from distant lands, no fresh linen sheets awaiting their return home. Clean meant you didn't feel itchy. It meant your hands didn't stick when you needed bread. It meant the rash behind your knees had softened for a day or two, or the ring of soot around your wrists had finally worn away. Most days, dirt was simply part of the skin, embedded, familiar, a sign of labor, of usefulness, of participation in the slow business of staying alive. But sometimes, like after a bath, there was a strange lightness to the body, a sense that the air touched you differently, that you could stretch without feeling the pull of grime behind the joints. Still, bathing was rare for a reason, and not only because of water and wood. It was rare because it invited questions. Questions of health, of spirit, of morality. The church had opinions about cleanliness, and they were not always consistent. In Scripture, water was holy, used for baptism, for healing, for washing the feet of pilgrims and kings alike. Monks and nuns bathed more often than common villagers, and abbeys were among the few places where you might find constructed drainage, sluices, or even enclosed spaces dedicated to regular cleansing. But that cleanliness was symbolic. It was about purity of spirit, not the removal of sweat. When villagers bathed, it was not seen as spiritual. It was seen as indulgent, and sometimes even suspicious. There were priests, particularly in larger towns, who warned that too much concern with bodily cleanliness was a form of vanity. That washing too frequently exposed the body to temptation, both through sight and sensation. One chronicler, writing in the 14th century, described public bathhouses as fleshly temptations where steam and sin rise together. Bathing wasn't just risky to the body. It was risky to the soul. Ellenford's own priest was more practical. Father Wylan had lived in the village long enough to understand that telling people not to bathe was a fast way to see them stop attending Mass altogether. Still, even he spoke cautiously of the bathhouse. He gave it his blessing each season, walking the perimeter with a sprig of wet rosemary, muttering a psalm beneath his breath, then lighting a taper from the hearth and extinguishing it in the kettle. A gesture meant to remind villagers that fire and water must always answer to God. But he never bathed there himself. His cleanliness came from prayer and linen, from silence and candlelight. The village respected him for it. They also avoided him for 3 days after midsummer when the heat brought out a sourness beneath his robes that no sermon could conceal. It was a strange contradiction. Cleanliness was desired, but not dwelled upon. Dirt was expected, but not entirely accepted. And in between those two, the bathhouse sat quietly, waiting to be opened only when the season turned and the rules bent slightly toward comfort. Among the villagers, old traditions clung more stubbornly than soot. Merritt, the keeper of the bathhouse, swore by the rhythms of the moon when it came to washing. You bathed only after the third quarter. Anything earlier risked opening the blood. Mothers taught their daughters to never wash their hair on holy days, lest the saints think you cared more for beauty than redemption. Young boys were warned not to bathe on fasting days, not because it was forbidden, but because the devil likes to hide in steam. Not everyone believed these things, but not believing didn't mean ignoring. Belief was habit, and so bath days followed a pattern so deeply ingrained that no one needed to speak it aloud. First came the women, always together, never alone. They bathed in silence, backs turned toward each other except when offering assistance. No mirrors, no laughter, just the rhythm of rinsing and the occasional instruction from merit. The women wore shifts for modesty, thin linen smocks that clung to their skin, but offered a veil between the body and scrutiny. After them came the men, louder, looser, less ceremonial. They brought their own herbs sometimes, rue, mugwort, crushed garlic, not for cleanliness, but for health. They believed in drawing fever out through sweat, in bathing as a way to release ill humors. One man even claimed that submerging his feet in hot water cured his limp for 2 days each month. No one challenged him. And lastly came the children, squealing, chaotic, and rarely still. They turned the bathhouse from sacred to circus in the span of minutes, splashing, giggling, wading ankle deep while their mothers scrubbed behind their ears with calloused thumbs. To them, the bath was a joy, a novelty. They had not yet learned to fear the steam or resent the water's cold. Return after warmth had fled. The bathhouse, for all its simplicity, held layers. It was more than a building. It was a crossing point between belief and instinct, between ritual and survival, between the soul and the skin. And while the bathwater ran dark by the end of the day, no one seemed disturbed by it. Filth was part of the process. Seeing it leave the body was proof that the bath had worked. But as evening fell, and the last child was lifted from the basin, wrapped in a wool shawl too big for their small shoulders, a different kind of ritual began. Merit would draw the last of the water from the cauldron and pour it onto the earth behind the building, always in the same spot, always with a whispered rhyme too quiet to catch. Then she would close the shutters, draw a line of chalk across the threshold, and place a sprig of juniper beside the door, not because she feared spirits or devils, but because old habits, like dirt, rarely washed away entirely, and in the glow of the last coals, the bathhouse would return to stillness, waiting for the next time the village decided to remember what it meant to feel almost clean. But that raises a question left lingering like steam against the rafters. If they knew how brief the comfort was, why did they return at all? The last time the bathhouse was opened that year, the frost had already begun to settle. It wasn't a harsh frost, not yet, but enough to make the fields crackle underfoot and turn the sheep's breath into ribbons in the morning light. The people of Ellenford knew what that meant. The window for warmth was closing. Soon, the bathhouse would be shuttered for good until the thaw returned, and the stream would run too slow to fill even a single bucket without a thin sheen of ice forming at the rim. The firewood would be rationed. The doors would be sealed. The inside would turn cold as the air outside, and the benches that had once steamed with the scent of rosemary and old soap would gather dust and silence. But before that happened, there came one last time. The air inside was different now. Not just warmer than the biting air outside, but heavier somehow, more final. Even Merritt, who had sat in her usual place on the bench by the hearth for over 30 years, moved slower than usual. She didn't say much this time, She didn't need to. Everyone knew what to do. The ritual was embedded in them like the memory of bread baking or bells tolling at dusk. Each family had sent one person. That was all they could spare now. One body to represent the household. One body to carry the warmth home, like a torch against the coming dark. The women came first, as they always did. But they didn't linger. They rinsed quickly, shoulders tense, glancing now and again at the windows as if expecting the wind to blow in. They murmured to each other. Not gossip, not chatter, but reminders. The broth's still on. He hasn't mended the roof yet. I'll bring the wool tomorrow. Their conversation was stitched with preparation, not comfort. The water was cooler today. The firewood had been damp. The steam took longer to rise, and when it did, it carried the scent of pine and ash, not lavender. The herbs were gone. No one had been to the meadow in days, and the stores were being saved for illness. It was a different kind of bath, not indulgent, not even cleansing, just warm enough to chase the chill from their hands and soft enough to remind them that skin, beneath everything else, still mattered. The men came next, but with fewer jokes this time. Their hands were rougher, their boots tracked in more mud. One man bathed with his shirt still on, too cold to take it off. Another scraped his elbows with a stick wrapped in coarse wool. They didn't talk much. Their silence wasn't solemn. It was simply focused. They were thinking of what still needed to be hauled before the snows came. What tools still needed mending. Which roofs would hold and which ones wouldn't. And then came the children. Fewer than usual. Most too young to need it, or too fragile for cold. But 3 little boys darted inside, laughing at first, until they saw how quiet the room had become. They stripped without ceremony, dunked their feet, then sat still, oddly still, watching the water ripple from the ladle. The last to enter was a woman named Iseult. She had just lost her husband to a fever and hadn't been seen for weeks. She came barefoot, wrapped in an old woolen cloak, hair unbraided. The others made room without question. No one asked her anything. Merritt handed her a clean rag without a word. Iseult stepped into the basin slowly, lowered herself until the water kissed her collarbones, then closed her eyes. She didn't move for a long time. When she finally did, it was only to lean forward and pour a final ladle of water over her shoulders, as if washing off the last remnants of something she couldn't name. That was when it began to snow. It came softly at first, flakes barely visible in the misted windows, but within minutes, it grew thick and fast. Merritt rose from her bench and went to the window, peering out with eyes too old to be surprised. Then she turned to the room and said, as she had every year for as long as anyone could remember, "That's the last of it then." The basins were emptied. The water was poured out behind the building. The shutters were latched. The cauldron's fire burned down to embers. The villagers dressed again, layer upon layer of rough cloth, woolen caps pulled low, boots stiff with use, and one by one, they stepped out into the falling white. No one lingered. There was no need. The bath had done what it was meant to do. Not to clean, not to transform, but to prepare, to ready the body for the stillness of winter, to remind the skin that it still belonged to the living even if it would not feel warmth again for months. It was not about hygiene. It was about endurance. And perhaps that was the most honest kind of cleanliness. Not one that glowed or gleamed, but one that held. The bathhouse would remain there through the snows, its roof sagging further under the weight of cold. No one would speak of it until spring, and when the first warm breeze stirred the stream again, someone, no one ever knew who, would walk down, check the cauldron, test the hinges, and hang the bucket sign on the door. But that was still months away. For now, the bath was done. The village turned inward, and beneath their layers of wool, their calloused hands, their silent preparations, they remembered what it felt like, for just one day, to be warm. The nobleman didn't smell like roses. That would be too generous. He smelled like clove, myrrh, musk, and faintly, last week's wool. A scent that sat in the folds of his velvet sleeves, lingered on the edge of his embroidered collar, and left a trail in the air behind him as he walked from chamber to hall. Not unpleasant, exactly. Not clean either. It was a smell carefully built, deliberately layered, and constantly maintained. His servants refreshed it twice daily with damp cloths and precious oils, not because the nobleman cared for sweetness, but because in the circles he moved within, being scented was more important than being clean. Water was not trusted in these halls. It was whispered even in the grand estates that full-body immersion left a man vulnerable, that bathing opened the pores too widely, that it made the body soft and susceptible to vapors, colds, and invisible ailments. Physicians debated these things in Latin behind closed doors. Priests muttered about indulgence. But the nobleman knew only this: too much water made you fragile, and a scent, especially a powerful scent, guarded you. He was not alone in this belief. In the castles of Burgundy, in the courts of Castile, in the villas of Provence, noblemen rose each morning not to bathe, but to be perfumed. Before the first goblet of wine, before the morning letters were delivered, they were attended by valets, bearing cloth soaked in floral waters and alcohol tinctures, liquids steeped with herbs like rosemary, mint, cinnamon bark, sage. These cloths were dabbed behind the ears, under the arms, along the neck, down the back of the hands. The ritual was not brief. It took time, and it was not meant to be rushed. Cleanliness had nothing to do with removal. It was about layering. The nobleman owned no fewer than 12 scented pouches, each filled with a unique blend. One hung in his closet. Another was tucked beneath his pillow. A third was sewn into his hat. He changed them out with the seasons. In spring, dried violet and crushed juniper. In winter, sage and bitter orange. These sackets did not overpower. They announced. They said, this man has access to spices that came across oceans. This man has silk imported with the permission of kings. This man does not touch dirty water like a peasant. And in this era, water was a class divider as much as anything else. The peasantry bathed out of necessity, when mud covered their arms or when childbirth left them trembling, but nobles could afford to avoid it. In fact, avoidance was a form of pride. You didn't need to wash, because you had other methods. You could have cloths boiled, scented, wrung out, and brought to your bedchamber. You could have your linens changed twice a week. You could sleep in shirts scented with lavender and pressed by hand. You could mask any scent you disliked. And more importantly, you didn't sweat. Or at least you pretended not to. Hygiene, in noble circles, was not a practice. It was a performance. Take the nobleman's boots, for example. They were rarely cleaned with water. Instead, they were rubbed with a paste made of vinegar and beeswax, then wrapped in cloth and polished with dried lemon peel. His gloves were lined in rabbit fur to absorb the moisture of the hands, and each night they were dried before the fire and lightly dusted with powdered camphor. His hat was occasionally perfumed with rose oil, not for his own pleasure, but so the queen's attendants would not wrinkle their noses when he bowed. Because scent in these spaces was not just personal, it was political. There were stories, even then, of men losing appointments at court because they carried the wrong aroma. One nobleman was once escorted from a royal supper because his perfume reminded the princess of a sick room. Another gained favor by wearing a blend that reminded the duke of his mother's garden in Toulouse. These were not accidents. Recipes were exchanged like secrets. Merchants competed to bring the newest floral waters from Venice. And for those who could not afford such extravagance, there were improvised solutions. Lemon juice boiled with thyme, crushed mint pressed into cups, vinegar mixed with herbs, and left to steep in the sun. It wasn't that these men believed they were clean. It's that they believed they had transcended dirt. Water was for the body, but scent, that was for the soul. Still, beneath all the oils and sachets and dried petals, the truth remained. The nobleman hadn't washed his back in months. His scalp itched beneath the perfumed powder. His boots, though polished, hid calluses and long-neglected toenails. His undergarments, even when changed, left behind traces of salt and skin. But none of that mattered if no one noticed. If the fragrance was strong enough, if the illusion was maintained. That, after all, was the goal. Not health, not comfort, reputation. And so, each morning, the nobleman stood still as his valet dabbed his brow with rose water. He flexed his fingers as cinnamon oil was massaged into his wrists. He exhaled, slowly, as the final sachet was tied beneath his collar. And when he stepped into the great hall, nodding to peers and servants alike, the scent arrived before his voice. But that leads to a question worth asking. Did he believe it himself? Or had he forgotten what it meant to feel truly clean? In the nobleman's world, nothing touched the skin by accident. Everything that came into contact with his body, from the linen undershirt to the scented powders that dusted his collar, had passed through layers of servants, ritual, and scrutiny. The morning toilet was not just a routine. It was a spectacle, an assertion of control over the chaos of filth and mortality. Cleanliness in his chambers was not a matter of removing sweat or soil. It was a daily act of reshaping the self into something palatable, something above the human. The valet knew every step by heart. First came the warming of the cloths, soaked in alcohol-distilled waters, steeped with herbs gathered from the kitchen garden, or purchased in bundles from the apothecary stalls. Basil and marjoram in summer, clove and pine resin in winter. The cloths were wrung out, then folded carefully, so the nobleman's hands would never touch the source of the scent directly. He didn't want to feel the damp. He only wanted to receive it. Next, his hair was combed and powdered, not because he had bathed it, but because the powder itself absorbed the oils. Powdered wigs had not yet taken hold in this particular court, but the habit of masking the scalp's true state was centuries old. In earlier days, rosemary oil might have been rubbed directly into the scalp, or a small sachet of dried lavender sewn into the cap. Here, his hair was parted, combed flat, and then dusted with a fine layer of crushed herbs mixed with starch or chalk. The effect was more ceremonial than cleansing, but that was the point. The nobleman did not sweat publicly. He did not scratch. He did not need to excuse himself to the bath, because the bath, as understood by the lower classes, was no longer seen as respectable. In fact, by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the very idea of full-body washing had begun to acquire a kind of vulgarity. Once, public bathhouses had been thriving centers of urban life, a place to gossip and negotiate and occasionally, yes, bathe. But over time, their reputation had decayed, tainted by moral suspicion, blamed for outbreaks of disease, and increasingly associated with the poor or the foreign. Nobles who had once bathed side by side in perfumed pools began to withdraw. They didn't stop caring about their bodies. They just stopped washing them with water. And so scent took water's place. The perfume chamber, for the wealthiest households, became almost as important as the kitchen. It was stocked with ceramic jars, pewter bowls, linen bundles filled with dry blends, and oils kept in stoppered vials nestled in wool to keep them from spoiling. These were not purchased in haste. The recipes for these mixtures were often passed down through generations or sent in secret between noblewomen like coded letters. Some were said to protect against plague. Others were chosen for mood, calming, invigorating, seductive, or severe. Each scent carried meaning, both social and personal. And the nobleman, though he never crushed herbs with his own hands, took the matter seriously. He had a ledger in which he recorded combinations he preferred. Rose and cinnamon for festivals, pine and nutmeg for winter councils, bergamot and clove for courtship. He kept notes on how long the scent lingered, whether it provoked sneezing, whether the bishop complimented it, whether the queen turned away, because that, too, was part of the ritual. Not just the wearing of scent, but the witnessing of it. Cleanliness was a kind of communication, a wordless argument that said, I am above decay. I am immune to the base needs of the body. I am in control. Of course, not all nobles subscribed to this with equal fervor. There were some, usually older men from distant provinces, who still kept bathing tubs hidden in their private quarters, guarded like relics. They might send servants to fetch snowmelt or warm rainwater to fill them. They bathed quietly, secretly, without announcing it to others. To do so openly would be to admit to a kind of softness. But to those who still remembered the years before plague and paranoia, water still held meaning, still offered release. The nobleman did not. He had grown up in the newer world, the more cautious one, the one where water carried illness and odor, could be mastered by art. He did not remember bathhouses. He remembered processions, mourning cloths, spiced oils rubbed into the chest to prevent winter chills, vinegar foot baths on saint days, things that mimicked hygiene but never invited the vulnerability of immersion. And in that space, between performance and reality, he became a kind of mask, always scented, never sweating, always pressed, never washed. His chamber, too, followed suit. The floors were strewn with herbs. His bed linens were sprinkled with dried flowers before being warmed by coals. Even his writing desk was lined with cedar planks to ward off the scent of ink and paper mold. How, I'm sorry. Bought. He lived inside a world carefully arranged to avoid the organic, where nothing spoiled, nothing peeled, nothing rotted. But no ritual, no matter how ornate, could fully shield the body from time. The nobleman's skin began to itch beneath the perfumes. The powders clung in places they shouldn't. The oils built up, layer upon layer, until his collars bore permanent shadows. He would scratch in private. He would wake with a heaviness in his lungs, as if the very air in his chamber had thickened. The scent that once symbolized grace now clung like guilt, and he began to wonder, quietly, guiltily, what it might feel like to let water touch his skin. Not scented water, not cloths wrung and folded, but water itself, free, full, and honest. He never asked for it, but he dreamed of it. And perhaps that dream says more than any sachet ever could. Because for all his perfumes, the nobleman still carried the body beneath. And no scent, not even the most sacred, could keep that truth away forever. He never asked for it. But one spring morning, long after the frost had lifted from the outer walls, and the air coming through the lancet windows began to smell faintly of new grass and thawed earth, the nobleman found himself alone. His servants had been dismissed for the hour. The bell for morning prayers had not yet rung. A letter sat unopened on his desk. The fire had gone low, and only a single thin line of smoke curled into the beams above. It was the silence that made him think of it again, not the scent of oils or the prickle of powder on his skin, but the absence of ritual. The room, for a moment, no longer held its ceremony. It was just air, dust, stoned out. A draft from the window that made his wrists ache with something older than pain. An absence he couldn't name. And that was when he did it. He walked into the far chamber, past the screen that separated his sleeping space from the servants' corridor, and opened the chest beneath the hanging tapestries. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled linen and long forgotten, was the copper basin. It was dented in one corner, cold to the touch. The handle was stiff with age. No one had used it in years. He unfolded the cloth, ran his hand along the rim, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, imagined filling it, not with perfume or wine or vinegar infused with lavender, just water, drawn from the well, heated perhaps or not. He wasn't sure. He didn't even know how long it would take. But the image was there now, rooted. What would it be like to step into water, not to cleanse appearances, but to feel, not to remove odor, not to impress, but to remind his skin that it was still part of him? There had been a time, long before court, long before velvet and titles, and the endless inspections of every inch of his color, when he had bathed in rivers, with cousins, with friends, with no sense but moss and sun. He had come out shivering, yes, but grinning, his hair plastered to his head, his feet brown with mud, and he had been alive. Now he wondered if the body he wore, beneath all of this ceremony, had begun to forget what that felt like. Still, he said nothing to the servants. He allowed the morning ritual to resume. Cloths were warmed, perfume was dabbed, notes were delivered, guests were announced. His hat was powdered, his boots polished. By midday he had forgotten where he had placed the basin, or pretended to. He attended council. He made polite conversation. He complimented a visiting bishop on the scent of his handkerchief. But that night, he dreamed of water, not of rivers, not of movement or splashing or joy. He dreamed of stillness, a tub filled to the rim, steam rising faintly, and his own hand breaking the surface, fingertips sinking beneath into warmth, not meant for presentation, but for presence. When he woke, the scent in his chamber had changed. Subtle, but there. The flowers in the sachets had begun to rot. It had been too warm, too damp. The petals had softened, darkened, fermented into something not unpleasant, but wrong. The perfume was fading, not from age, from time. He summoned no one. He sat in the middle of the room, fully clothed, the basin still wrapped in linen by the screen, and listened to his own breathing. It was the only thing that had not been scented. There was no final moment of rebellion, no announcement that he would bathe. The basin remained dry. The ritual continued. The world did not change, but the nobleman did. Not in his appearance, not in the powders or oils, but in the quiet space between them. Where a man once convinced he could mask himself from the truth now began, ever so slightly, to remember his own skin. In the dim light of the abbey cloister, water moved silently down a worn stone channel, diverted from the nearby stream, and guided gently past a moss-covered foundation. The monks who built it centuries earlier had carved it with care, stone by stone, slope by slope, not for beauty, but for function. The water was meant for drinking, for washing vegetables, for cooling fevered foreheads in times of illness. But it was not generally for bathing, not in the way we might understand it today. In the medieval world, the church sat at the center of nearly everything. Ritual, timekeeping, literacy, law. And it had a complicated relationship with cleanliness. You might imagine that a religion steeped in metaphors of purification, of baptism and rebirth, would encourage washing. And in some ways it did. The act of washing feet before Mass, the sprinkling of holy water before entering sacred space, the great immersion of baptism, where a soul passed from sin into grace. But these were spiritual waters, symbolic, ritualized. When it came to the body, especially the full body, things were more tangled. Bathing was a slippery subject. For the early Christian fathers, physical cleanliness was often treated with suspicion. To care too much for the body, to indulge in its comfort, to soften it with warm waters and oils, was seen as vanity, or worse, lust. There was an undercurrent of belief that bathing tempted the senses, stirred pride, or encouraged immoral thoughts. Saints were often praised not for their hygiene, but for their endurance of filth. They fasted. They slept on bare ground. They wore the same garments for years, their hair matted with dirt and tears. In the stories passed down through sermons and manuscripts, holiness had a smell, and it wasn't rosewater. Take Saint Guthlac, for example, a hermit who lived in the fens of East Anglia. He built his home in a bog, slept on reeds, and was said to be so pure that demons attacked him with visible hatred. Or Saint Cuthbert, who lived alone on a remote island and washed only once to prepare his body for death. These men weren't just tolerated in their unwashed state. They were revered for it. Their dirtiness was evidence of their detachment from earthly pleasure. And yet, monks did wash. Carefully, quietly, according to strict schedules. In most Benedictine monasteries there was a lavatorium, a room where hands were washed before meals, where faces were wiped, and on rare occasions where feet were soaked. Once or twice a year, monks might be permitted to bathe fully. In some houses, especially in warmer climates or wealthier abbeys, there might even be a bathhouse, small, stark, steamless, but no mirrors, no oils, and certainly no conversation, because silence, like cleanliness, was tied to purity. The church never issued a sweeping ban on bathing, but it did shape how people thought about it. Bathing was framed as something that had to be controlled, not because it was unhealthy, but because it could lead to moral slippage. Nakedness, especially when shared or unattended, was dangerous. Steam blurred the edges between body and soul. And indulgence, even in hot water, was an invitation for sin to slip in through the pores. Confessors, especially in urban parishes, sometimes asked women about their bathing habits, not to scold them for washing, but to assess if the act had led to temptation. Had they bathed alone? With another? Was there enjoyment? Were there oils? Was it for the skin or for the flesh? You see, in this world, intention mattered just as much as action. To bathe for humility, acceptable. To bathe for vanity, suspect. And the line between the two was always moving. In medieval medical theory, bathing could be both remedy and risk. It opened the pores, softened the skin, relaxed the body, but that openness made you vulnerable to disease, to drafts, to sin. Doctors recommended hot baths only in certain seasons, for certain humors with specific herbs. But spiritual advisors worried that such softness might extend into the soul. So, how did people navigate it? Cautiously. And often, with contradiction. A woman might rinse her hands before prayer, but not her face, fearing the act would be seen as preening. A monk might wash his feet on Maundy Thursday, but not again until Christmas. A priest might soak in warm wine and herbs to soothe gout, then preach a sermon on the virtue of self-denial. The church, in all its complexity, never outlawed bathing, but it controlled the narrative. It praised the saints who lived in rags and shunned those who anointed themselves with scented oils. It taught that cleanliness was next to godliness, only when defined on its own terms. And so, for much of the Middle Ages, cleanliness became a quiet, private thing. A foot soaked under moonlight, a hand dipped into a cold stream after confession, a cloth wiped behind the ears not to impress, but to feel one moment of comfort before pulling the wool hood back over the skin. It wasn't that people didn't want to be clean, it's that they had been taught to fear how. And that leaves us wondering, if purity was measured by restraint, how did anyone ever learn to feel good inside their own skin? Not all bathing was forbidden. Some of it simply wasn't discussed. Inside the stone walls of monasteries and abbeys, where life moved according to the rhythm of bells and psalms, washing was permitted, just not emphasized. The monks, cloaked in silence and wool, lived by rule. The most widespread was the rule of Saint Benedict. And, while it addressed many things, when to eat, how to pray, what to read, it did not speak loudly about water, which meant, as was so often the case in medieval life, that the absence of guidance left room for quiet negotiation. In some monasteries, especially those built near rivers or springs, water was used regularly. Hands were washed before meals. Feet were rinsed during Holy Week. Linen undergarments worn next to the skin were changed weekly or monthly, depending on the wealth of the house and the severity of the climate. There were records of monks bathing together, modestly, draped in thin linen shifts, scrubbing their arms with cloths steeped in warmed vinegar and bay leaves. But these moments were not celebrated. They were not written into the illuminated margins of sacred texts. They were not sung about in the choir stalls. They simply happened. And they happened usually without joy. The lavatorium, the communal washing space, was functional, not comforting. No mirrors hung on the walls. No decoration adorned the space. The water, often cold and slow, ran along a channel carved in stone, worn smooth by decades of dripping. In winter, it iced over. In summer, it carried algae. But it moved, and movement meant use. The monks washed their hands before meals, and wiped them on shared towels. Some soaked their feet once a week. Heads were shaved, tonsured, on a regular cycle, and with that ritual came a kind of washing. The scalp was wiped, scraped, sometimes oiled, but only as needed. No indulgence, no bathing for pleasure. Because the body was not to be trusted. It was a vessel for suffering, a place where temptation could take root like mold in the corner of a cistern. To enjoy the feeling of warm water over your back. That was pride, or softness, or the first step on a slippery slope to sins that had no name in daylight. Yet, there are glimpses, small ones, of comfort sneaking in. A monk in York wrote of warming his feet in a bucket before Vespers in December. Another, in France, mentions a bath shared with Brother Allard in quiet gratitude. And in Italy, a record from the 11th century describes a special bath prepared for the abbot once a month, involving heated stones and lemon balm leaves. These moments are rare, but they tell us something. That even in a world built on denial, The body refused to be ignored, and the people inside those woolen robes, chanting their hours, felt the same cold in their fingers, the same stiffness in their backs, the same weariness behind their eyes. The church taught that heaven rewarded restraint, that to deny the flesh was to lift the soul, but denial was never total. It was shaped by season, by rank, by geography. A monk in the hills of Wales might go months without full washing, while his counterpart near Palermo could sneak to the coast and soak his feet in the tide. And outside the cloister, in the greater religious culture of Europe, things were even less consistent. Pilgrims, for instance, often washed more than their neighbors, not because they were cleaner, but because their journeys required it. They crossed borders, passed through towns, entered shrines. They were expected to wash their hands before kissing relics, to wipe the dust from their feet before entering a chapel. Some hostels even kept barrels of rainwater just for this purpose. There were rules, too, many imposed by church councils, requiring priests to bathe before offering Mass on feast days. Not every priest obeyed, but the rule was there. Bathing wasn't banned. It was just watched, and every act of washing carried a shadow. Were you cleansing for health, or for pride, for function, or for vanity? That shadow never left. Even for women of the church, cleanliness was complicated. Nuns bathed rarely and only under permission. Some convents allowed washing of the face and hands each morning, but restricted bathing of the whole body to a few times per year. A record from an abbey in Normandy shows that bathing was permitted before the taking of vows, but only then, and never again without illness or instruction. Modesty was everything. They bathed clothed. They bathed silently, and they bathed quickly. Yet even they found moments of grace in it. A letter from a nun to her sister speaks of washing another's feet by candlelight, of how the water turned pink with cracked skin and calluses, of how it reminded her of the stories of Christ, not holy in ritual, but holy in care. Perhaps that was the closest bathing ever came to being embraced, not as indulgence, but as service. To wash another, to soothe someone else's body when your own felt too sinful to notice. Still, the overarching tone remained. The body was not to be trusted, and water, in too much abundance, threatened the soul. So, people washed in pieces. They wiped, they sprinkled, they sponged with wine or vinegar. They cleaned what could be cleaned without inviting scrutiny, and they lived with the rest. But what happens, we might ask, to a faith built on purity when the tools of purification are fear? And how long can the body carry dirt before the soul begins to wonder if it belongs to it anymore? They told the story for generations, often from pulpits, sometimes around hearths, occasionally written in the margins of old psalters. It was the story of a saint. His name changed depending on who was telling it. Who, when offered a warm bath after a long pilgrimage, refused it. He had walked for days through dust and heat, his robes stiff with salt, his feet cracked and raw. A kind host opened his door, offered him bread and broth and water to bathe. The saint took the bread. He drank the broth. But when shown the bath, he smiled and said, "I carry my cleanliness inside me." And then he lay down to sleep on the floor. To modern ears, this sounds like madness, or at best, self-inflicted discomfort. But to those who heard it centuries ago, it was wisdom. This man, they believed, had learned to conquer the body, and in conquering it, he had risen above it. A bath would have been a defeat. That was the moral anyway. But beneath that story, beneath the layers of devotion and denial, was something else. A world in which the spiritual and the physical were always wrestling, where people believed the body mattered only as a vessel, but still felt every ache, every itch, every weight of grime that clung to their skin through weeks without washing. The church may have spoken of purity, but the people lived with dirt. There were other stories too. Stories the priests didn't always tell aloud. Stories that passed between mothers and midwives, between washerwomen and traveling monks. Stories of saints who did bathe quietly when illness made the body unbearable. Stories of abbots who kept their hands soft with olive oil, even as they preached austerity. Stories of bishops who allowed themselves to be anointed not just with holy oil, but with rose water before appearing in court. They were not common, but they existed. And those contradictions, those secret washings and quiet comforts, were part of the real church. The one lived in bodies, not just in books. Because in truth, the church was not a single voice. It was 1,000 voices murmuring in shadowed chapels and on windswept hills. Some spoke of fire and brimstone. Others whispered of kindness. Some preached abstinence from every comfort. Others taught that God made herbs smell sweet for a reason. And in the spaces between those voices, people lived. A merchant might avoid bathing for fear of spiritual weakness, then pay a boy to splash vinegar over his hands before market. A nun might fast for 40 days, then soak her feet in warm wine because her ankles swelled with prayer. A priest might preach against indulgence in the morning and take a secret steam in the bathhouse before compline. They were not hypocrites, most of them. They were human, and so they wrestled year after year with the simple, inconvenient fact that the body did not care about doctrine. It itched, stank, it ached when ignored, and sometimes it needed water, even when the soul said no. There are few records of how everyday Christians actually washed. Most of what survives was written by clergy, men concerned with the soul, not the skin. But here and there, we find fragments. A linen cloth passed down through 3 generations, soaked in lavender and boiled twice a year. A woman's wool that leaves behind the silver bowl for warming the baby's bath. A set of wooden combs found buried in a friar's grave, worn smooth by years of use. And then, of course, there's the silence. The fact that few wrote about bathing doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means it wasn't considered worth remembering. And yet, how many of us have been comforted more by warm water than by words? The church, by the end of the medieval period, began to soften. Not openly, not with proclamations, but in practice. Bathhouses, once condemned as places of sin, became tolerated again in some regions. Priests bathed more often. Monks began to wash robes and underclothes with greater frequency. And while no bishop declared bathing holy, neither did they all call it wicked. It had taken centuries, but slowly, a new understanding emerged. That perhaps the body was not the enemy. That perhaps water was not temptation, but mercy. Not all accepted it. Some clung to the old stories, the saints who never washed, the purity of sweat and soil. But others, quietly, in cloisters and cottages, began to see things differently, not because doctrine had changed, but because they had lived too long without comfort to ignore it any longer. And so, one by one, they began to wash. With cloths, with buckets, with rain collected in jars, not to erase sin, not to impress neighbors, but because the body mattered, because skin, like soul, deserves to be touched gently, and maybe, just maybe, that was the holiest truth of all. She carried her work in a bundle, not on a cart, not on a mule, just a thick roll of wrapped linen strapped tight across her shoulders, heavier than it looked and damp with the scent of lye and cold air. Inside were her tools, a wooden paddle for beating fabric, a tin pot of coarse soap made from ash and fat, a comb carved from bone, and her hands, always red, always cracked, always moving. She was known only as Marta, though no one could say where she had come from, or when exactly she had begun to travel. But everyone remembered her leaving, usually before sunrise, her shawl pulled tight and steam rising from the basin she'd left behind. Marta was a washerwoman, but not like the others. Most women washed for their own households, or perhaps for the manor, when the servants fell ill. Some washed linens for coin, but they stayed put, near hearths, near wells, near relatives. Marta moved, village to village, hamlet to town. She arrived like a change in weather, without fanfare, without noise, and left the same way, often before her name had settled on the mouths of those who paid her. She washed in streams, in troughs, in kitchen basins, and under leaking roofs. But most often, she washed in silence. Her clients rarely asked questions. They left soiled garments at the edge of their porches or on the steps of the chapel, wrapped in old cloth and tagged with crude chalk symbols to mark ownership. Marta would collect them in the early morning, before the bells rang, and by dusk, sometimes a day later, sometimes two, they would be returned. Not white, not perfect, but better, rinsed, scrubbed, wearable again. That was all most people could hope for. In winter, things grew harder. The water froze faster. The soap turned stiff. Her hands, already lined like weathered bark, began to split open along the knuckles, tiny red lines that stung with every motion. But she did not stop. She built fires when she could, heated stones, thawed the water by candlelight in borrowed sheds. Her breath rose in front of her face like incense. Her sleeves stuck to her arms from steam and frost. The cloths she washed were not noble linens or embroidered robes. They were coarse undershirts, baby wrappings, men's trousers worn shiny from years of use. Occasionally, a lace cuff or a velvet sleeve would appear in the pile, a cast-off from a manor or traveling merchant. She treated them no differently. Dirt was democratic. It touched every class, and she, unlike the lords she never saw, removed it. People whispered about her, of course. Any woman who moved freely was suspect. Some said she was a widow of war. Others thought she had been born in a leper house, cast out when the rules changed. A few believed she carried a map in her head of every stream and washing stone from here to the sea. No one knew for certain, and she never told, but they paid her. Always. A crust of bread, a coin, a turnip, once a pair of shoes. She never asked for more. The work was steady, dirty, but honest, and it earned her a kind of respect. Low, rough-edged, but real. The respect given to those who perform the necessary but unseen labor of the world. Marta did not bless weddings or bury the dead, but she washed the cloths they wrapped their lives in, and for that, the villages let her stay. Briefly, never long. No one wanted a washerwoman too near. She reminded them of the things they couldn't clean themselves. One winter, colder than most, she arrived in a town where the well had frozen solid. The river was too far, the snow too hard, and yet the villagers had clothes for her. Dirty ones, stiff with frost and fear. So she lit a fire behind the blacksmith's barn, found an old copper basin and a pile of tools, chopped ice from the edge of a frozen barrel, melted it over the coals, slow and steady, until steam rose from the rim. The children came to watch. They had never seen a woman stir water with her hands in the snow, never seen the steam mix with falling flakes, turning the air into fog. Marta did not speak to them, but she did not turn them away either. She scrubbed slowly, rhythmically, dipping, wringing, beating cloth against the side of the basin. The sound was steady, comforting, like breath, like prayer. And when she finished, she stood, her back aching, her hands red and raw, and said only one thing: "Don't let it freeze before it dries." They didn't. They hung the linens by the hearth across chairs over beds, and when they handed her a piece of dried meat and a jug of warm cider, she nodded once and moved on. She left the basin behind. It was frozen again by morning, but someone, no one knew who, kept it there, upside down, resting beside the barn as if it belonged. It became a kind of monument, a frozen bowl to a woman who scrubbed stories from the seams of others and never left her own behind. And that leads to a question that lingers longer than steam. Did Marta cleanse the world one cloth at a time, or simply remind it that even the dirtiest things could be touched? She didn't talk to the clothes, but she often felt they were speaking to her. Not in words, of course, not in whispers or voices, but in weight, in the folds, in the fibers. Marta had washed enough garments in her life to know when something was just dirt and when it was something else. Grief soaked into wool, panic clinging to the hem of a shift, shame pressed deep into the cuffs of a shirt, too fine for a farmer's house. She could feel these things in her hands before she even began to scrub. A stain might be blood, yes, but blood from where? From childbirth, or from a fight? From an accident in the field, or from something no one wanted to speak of? The clothes didn't always tell her, not clearly, but they hinted, and after enough time, she learned how to listen. In one village, smaller than most, barely more than 5 huts and a church with a cracked bell, someone had left her a bundle wrapped tighter than usual, tied with rope and tucked inside an old flour sack. She opened it carefully, as she always did, and found a child's nightshirt, yellowed at the collar and stiff with something darker near the sleeves. It was small, too small even for the youngest child she'd seen peering around the corners that morning, and as she held it up to the light, it dawned on her that the stain wasn't new. It was old, set in, left to dry for too long. Still, she washed it. The water in her basin turned gray, then red, then clear again. She never asked who the shirt belonged to. She never saw it again. But when she left the village 3 days later, a woman followed her to the edge of the road, placed a boiled egg in her hand, and touched her shoulder gently before walking away. Nothing was said. Nothing had to be. This was part of the work. She didn't just remove dirt. She removed memory, or at least softened it. The people she served didn't thank her with words. They thanked her with bread, with dried apples, with a place to sleep in the corner of a barn where the animals were still warm. That was enough. She never asked for a bed, a fire, a name. She didn't need them. The road gave her its own rhythm. Walking by moonlight, working by firelight, sleeping when the wind was still and the basin had emptied. She followed the water, and where the water stopped, she waited for it to melt. But even a washerwoman had her limits. There were times, especially deep into winter, when her fingers would bleed before midday, when the soap turned to stone inside its tin, when her knees ached from crouching on frozen boards. Once, she slipped on black ice and hit her elbow so hard she couldn't lift her bucket for a week. That week, no one's clothes got washed. Some complained. Others said nothing. They waited, because they knew Marta worked until she couldn't. And when she stopped, it was not because she was lazy, but because something inside her had cracked. She didn't cry when she hurt. She didn't scream, but sometimes late at night, in a borrowed shed or curled in a pile of straw, she would press her hand to her own ribs, breathe slowly, and think about the time before she'd started walking, the time before she had known what boiled soap smelled like when it burned, before she could judge a family's secrets by the color of their pillowcases. She remembered a man once. His name she couldn't hold on to, but his hands had been warm. He'd laughed with his whole mouth. He'd been gone by winter. And after that, the road began. She never said she was running, but she never stayed still. In every village, there was someone who feared her. A child who thought she was a witch. A priest who thought her work too close to the body, too intimate. A woman who didn't want her laundry handled by a stranger who didn't ask for payment up front. But there was always one house, just one, that understood. And from that house came the first bundle. And with that bundle came the invitation, unspoken. Stay just long enough to help us forget how dirty we've become. She did. And then she left. She left before spring. Always before spring. Spring was when the water ran too fast. When the rivers melted and the snow revealed too much beneath. Spring was for sowing, for mending, for facing what had been hidden under snow. Her work was winter's work. Work of endurance, of quiet hands and lowered eyes. Work for when people couldn't look at themselves and needed someone else to lift the grime away, if only a little. But not everything could be lifted. She once washed a noblewoman's shift, carried to her by a servant girl so young she couldn't meet Marta's eyes. The linen was silk blended, too fine for any village seamstress. The blood on it was old, and it had been washed before, roughly, carelessly, without real effort. Marta soaked it 3 times, not to remove the stain. That was impossible. But to soothe it, to remind the cloth that someone had cared enough to be gentle. She folded it slowly, wrapped it in wool, and handed it back without a word. The girl returned the next morning with a loaf of white bread. Marta didn't eat it. She placed it by the church door and moved on. She was not a priest. She was not a healer. She could not give forgiveness. Only water. But sometimes, that was enough. Still, there were days when she wondered how much longer she could carry the basin. Her arms, once strong, had begun to tremble in the evenings. Her knees creaked when she knelt. Her fingers no longer flexed without pain. The soap took longer to melt. The water, longer to heat. She wondered, sometimes, if the basin would one day be too heavy, if she would have to leave it behind on the side of the road, like a relic from a life she could no longer carry. But she never did, because each time she thought to stop, someone left a bundle, and as long as someone needed her, she would stay until the last stain was softened. The first time a village forgot to leave her a bundle, Marta didn't take it as an insult. She assumed they'd been busy or sick, or perhaps the weather had made them wary of bringing things out. Snow had fallen the night before, thick and sudden, wet enough to soak through a roof if the thatch was thin. Fires would needed stoking. Children kept close. She waited half a day near the inn, sharpening her paddle with a scrap of sanded bone, then walked to the chapel steps just to be sure. Nothing. Nothing. No cloth sacks. No soiled sleeves bundled in straw. No basket marked with the familiar chalked X or thread-knotted string. The threshold was clean. It was the strangest thing she'd seen in months. Not because they didn't have laundry. Of course they did. But because no one had asked her to touch it. For a moment, she wondered if she had misread the village. Maybe her presence had gone sour. Maybe someone had whispered a story in the night about what her hands had once done. Maybe her silence had become too loud. That happened. Sometimes. Villages turned. People forgot what she offered and remembered instead what they feared. A woman with no husband, no children, no fixed roof, no place in any record, except for the occasional passing coin and the cleaned collar of a shirt. But then, as she stood beneath the chapel eaves, the priest appeared, gray-bearded, red-nosed, half asleep. "I think we've no need this week," he said with a shrug. Not unkind. The merchant woman left a new soap. "Everyone's been boiling things themselves." Marta nodded. She said nothing. She walked out of the village by evening. Some would have taken offense. Some might have pleaded for use, reminded them of the stains that cloth couldn't hide, the ones only years of rinsing could touch. But Marta had never believed she was owed anything. Her service had always existed between the lines, offered, accepted, and forgotten. When no one remembered to ask, she took it as a sign that her work was no longer needed. That was how she knew when to move on. The basin on her back bounced gently against her spine. It wasn't copper anymore. She'd traded that years ago for a cast iron one. Narrower, lighter, better suited for walking. It held heat better too, but it carried fewer memories. She missed the weight of the old one, the sound it made when set down on frozen stone, the echo it left when emptied. The new basin was quieter. Like her, winter turned to thaw as she walked. The ground softened. The streams ran faster. Laundry would be easier now. Every home would have its own bucket, its own fire, its own square of sun-warmed grass to dry a tunic. Fewer people would need her. That was always the pattern. In spring, people believed in their own hands again. She crossed a field of new barley and stopped beneath an alder tree, where a single bench sat crooked beside the path. One of those roadside spots where travelers once paused for bread or prayer. She set the basin down and sat. For the first time in weeks, she let her fingers rest. The skin along her knuckles had begun to grow smooth again. It always did. Just a little. When she paused long enough, the cracks healed, though the scars never left. She'd carried those with her for decades. Soft lines, dark with sun, paler near the joints. Her hands didn't look like the hands of a saint. They were not graceful, not clean, but they had carried water across counties, lifted, soiled fabric from icy streams, wiped blood from a mother's shawl, bile from a bishop's bedsheet, soot from a child's sleeping shirt. And what had they taken in return? Not wealth, not story, not even thanks. Only the knowledge that, for a brief moment, she had been needed. That the world had trusted her to make something less dirty, even if it never stayed clean. She looked at her basin then, empty, quiet, still carrying the smell of the last batch of lye soap and boiled vinegar. A few scratches ran along the rim, a dent on the side from where it had slipped in the dark, months ago, near the border of a village she no longer remembered. She ran her hand along its edge. Then she reached into her satchel, pulled out a square of coarse cloth, and began to polish it. Not because it was dirty, because it was hers, a part of her no one had ever asked to wash. That night she slept under the stars. Not beneath a roof, not beside a barn. No bundles waited for her in the morning, and that was all right, because for the first time in a long while, Marta had nothing to clean, except her memories. And some of them, she decided, didn't need rinsing at all. Long before perfume vendors lined the bridges and sewage ran openly through the gutters, Paris smelled clean. Not in the modern sense of sterile surfaces and soap-laced air, but clean in a way that spoke of hot water and deliberate effort, of heated basins, scraped skin, rising steam, and bodies made soft by the rhythm of public bathing. You see, there was a time, long before revolutions, before cafes and cathedrals were soaked in soot, when Paris had bathtubs. And not just tubs hidden in the private rooms of kings or noble estates, but public houses devoted to the act of bathing. They were called étuves, and in the 12th and 13th centuries, they flourished like steam rising through a thatched roof. At their height, there were dozens of them tucked throughout the city, some small and discreet, others sprawling and elaborate. Their names were charming, almost poetic. La Fleur, L'Ange, Le Cerf Blanc. Each one promised comfort, warmth, renewal. They catered to merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, midwives, and magistrates. Bathing, at least for a while, was not a luxury. It was a culture. You would walk in from the filth of the streets, narrow alleys where carts rattled over stone and horses left behind more than hoofprints, and step into a room of thick heat. The floors were damp, the air rich with a mingling of soap, sweat, oil, and herbs. Birch branches hung from rafters, used for light brushing of the skin to encourage circulation. Benches lined the walls. Water dripped steadily into wooden tubs or shallow stone pools, warmed from beneath by coals or diverted fires. It wasn't silent. It wasn't solemn. These were spaces of life, of scrubbing and gossip, of humming and breathing, and sometimes laughter echoing softly across the walls. Men and women bathed separately mostly, though in some places, depending on the customs of the neighborhood or the nature of the establishment, the lines blurred. Attendants were hired to pour water, massage aching backs, pluck stray hairs, and even sing lullabies to children bathed by weary mothers. For a brief time, Paris believed that to be clean was not sinful, that it could be communal, that it could be civilizing. The church at first did not complain. In fact, some orders quietly encouraged it. Monasteries had their own bathhouses. Clerics, especially in cities, often washed before sermons and ceremonies. A clean priest was not yet a contradiction. A clean pilgrim was welcomed more warmly. Water had not yet become suspect, but something changed. Not all at once, not with a decree, but gradually, like water cooling in an untended tub. First came the whispers, that étuves invited temptation, that the mixing of bodies, even separated by walls or shifts of time, bred sin, that bathing itself, so intimate, so sensual, could not be entirely innocent. Then came the accusations. Certain bathhouses doubling as places of pleasure, of secrecy, of transactions not measured in coin. The boundary between hygiene and hedonism grew thin, and in a city where morality was often measured in appearances, the bathhouse began to look suspicious. But it wasn't just morality that dimmed the steam. It was fear. Illness crept in through the streets, not the quiet sickness of age or cold weather, but plague, sudden and indiscriminate. Buboes, fever, death within days. And in the panicked search for blame, eyes turned to the baths, to the warm shared water, to the moist, enclosed air. The same places that had once symbolized health now reeked of danger. Bathhouses were shuttered, closed temporarily, said the city fathers. But temporary closures tend to linger when grief is deep and memories long. One by one, the tubs fell cold. The buildings once full of steam and human voices were repurposed or abandoned. Some were turned into storage. Some became taverns. Others crumbled. The names, La Fleur, Le Cerf Blanc, disappeared from conversation. And within a generation or two, most Parisians had never set foot in a bathhouse. They knew only the warnings. They learned from priests and mothers that too much washing thinned the blood, that opening the pores invited miasmas, That cleanliness was best left to the soul, not the skin. It was a strange forgetting. Not erasure exactly, but something subtler. The city didn't deny it had once bathed. It simply stopped speaking of it, like a dream half remembered after waking. And yet, the stone was still there. In certain corners of old neighborhoods, behind churches or beneath shops, there were vaulted rooms, low-ceilinged, tiled in faded patterns, where water had once pooled. People passed over them daily, never knowing the warmth that had once filled the space. Children played on streets named for herbs once used in soaps. Bakers kneaded dough on counters where massage oils had once rested. The city moved forward. The baths were left behind. And that leaves us with a question that history rarely answers directly. How does a city learn to fear what once made it feel alive? Even after the bathhouses closed, people still needed water. Paris did not forget how to thirst. The fountains still flowed. Wells were drawn. Cloth was rinsed. But bathing, the full, warm, immersive act of lowering the body into water, grew rare. And with each passing decade, it slipped further into the territory of risk rather than relief. What had once been a communal ritual became a private dilemma. You washed only what must be washed. Hands before a meal. Feet after a journey. The occasional face when dirt became visible. Anything more, anything indulgent was avoided. Blame, of course, was never placed solely on fear. It never is. There were always practical reasons. Wood was expensive. Heating water required time and servants. Space was limited in the city's cramped homes. Fire was a risk. And for the working poor, a full bath was simply not an option. The laborers in Paris didn't need reasons to avoid bathing. They needed reasons to survive the week. But still, a shadow lingered. A cultural suspicion had taken root, growing in the gaps left behind when the bathhouses shut their door. It was not that Parisians no longer desired to be clean. It was that they no longer trusted the means of getting there. Physicians wrote treatises warning of wetness, that the body, if soaked too often, would soften to weakness. That water, once warm, could invite cold into the bones. That disease, traveling on foul air and strange humors, could be inhaled more easily in the steam. It was, they claimed, better to open a window than to wash your back. So the body remained wrapped in linen, wool, cotton if one was wealthy. Layers were praised. They held in health. They kept the world out. Cleanliness came through changes in fabric, not contact with water. You washed your undergarments. You aired your cloaks. You brushed your skin with dry cloth, sprinkled with vinegar or rose water. Perfume replaced soap. Scent became armor, and the absence of visible grime was taken as good enough. Of course, not all agreed. Quiet dissenters remained. There were still healers, old women in alleys, midwives with strong hands and fir branches, who believed in washing. Not daily, not foolishly, but when needed. They boiled rainwater. They steeped herbs. They bathed fevers and cleaned wounds. And they remembered the warmth that once lived in the city's bones. Some of them even spoke of it, told their daughters about bathhouses with tiled floors and places where people sang while they scrubbed. But those stories were dismissed as sentimental, outdated. They were met with the same response that meets most uncomfortable truths. A polite nod, then a change of subject. Paris, for all its beauty, had developed a complicated relationship with its own body. And nowhere was this more obvious than among the elite. The mobility, desperate to remain distinguished and fearful of filth, adopted a new form of cleanliness, managed distance. Servants wiped their backs with cloths soaked in alcohol or floral tinctures. Hair was dusted with powder, not washed. Gloves were worn even indoors to keep the hands from touching unclean surfaces. Rooms were filled with scent, burned herbs, citrus peels, ambergris, anything to push back against the stink of a city that was no longer rinsed. In public, they smiled. In private, they scratched. The clergy, too, responded to the change. They no longer visited bathhouses with the casual ease of earlier generations. The church began to shift its stance, not with bold proclamations, but with silence. Bathing was no longer endorsed, even indirectly. Monasteries reduced their washing schedules. Confessors asked more pointed questions about the reasons behind one's desire to soak. Saints who had once been praised for their holy austerity now became examples to imitate. Stories of martyrs who refused to bathe became more popular. Dirt, once tolerated, was slowly canonized. And still, the people adapted. They carried sachets. They used gloves lined with vinegar. They turned to dry cloth and scented oils. They cleaned only in secret, and only in parts. A full bath, if taken at all, was done in private, hurried, and without discussion. The word etuve vanished from everyday speech, and yet the old bathhouses remained, quietly, patiently, beneath the streets, behind walls, their tiled floors hidden beneath firewood and dust, their pipes long dry, their benches warped with time. Occasionally, a brick would give way during a renovation and reveal a basin, long empty. Children would dare each other to step inside. A mason would mutter that the air still smelled faintly of cedar. And the city, so full of breath and brilliance, continued to forget. But forgetting is never complete. There were always those who asked questions, who wondered why the past had grown so quiet, and who, standing near the hollowed stone where water once pooled, whispered, not loudly, but enough. What if we were wrong to close the taps? By the time Paris entered its golden age of salons and scholars, of perfumes and powdered wigs, the old bathhouses were all but myth. The étuves that once welcomed the weary and the sick had been bricked over or turned into wine cellars. What remained of them? Arched entryways with soot-blackened keystones, fragments of tiled floors, the faint circular imprint where a copper tub once rested, lay quietly beneath the new foundations. The city was building upward now, growing layer upon layer, and like dust swept beneath a rug. The memory of water and steam and shared warmth was hidden, but never truly gone. Yet something strange persisted in the corners. An old woman in the Latin Quarter still brewed juniper and boiled vinegar in the back of her shop. Not to sell, but to bathe her feet in the winter. A schoolboy discovered a stone basin beneath his uncle's stable and filled it with snow just to watch it melt. A midwife, older than her hands allowed, insisted on rinsing her tools in water, scented with thyme and bay. They didn't call these acts bathing. They didn't even call them rituals. But they were, in some quiet way, memories that had survived without permission. The city was fragrant now, yes, but it was not clean. Scent had replaced washing. Fashion had replaced comfort. To be perfumed was not to be healthy. It was simply to be masked. Beneath the layers of rouge and rosewater, the powdered hair and starched collars, people still scratched, still ached, still bore the same bodies their ancestors once lowered into warm basins beside tiled hearth. But they no longer had names for that kind of comfort. They had forgotten what it meant to soak, to sweat, to wring water from a cloth and feel it steam against cold skin. A few physicians began to whisper otherwise. By the 17th century, small pamphlets appeared, usually written in cautious tones, often in Latin, suggesting that perhaps water had been too hastily condemned, that disease might not cling to steam, that dirt long ignored might carry more risk than a well-tended bath. A few wealthy households began building small bathing chambers again. Private, secluded, discreet. Paris did not return to its old ways overnight. But beneath the fear, a question lingered. What if we had misunderstood the water all along? Still, for most Parisians, the baths remained a thing of legend. They heard of them in old poetry, saw faint references in cathedral records. Once in a while, an architect restoring a crumbling wall would find a line of plumbing too sophisticated to belong to a house of that age, and would shake his head in confusion. But what was gone physically persisted, softly, in language. People still used the word étuve to describe a place that grew hot with bodies. They called cramped kitchens sweating rooms. They said the air was boiling when the summer arrived. Even in forgetting, the memory shaped their speech. That's the trick of memory, especially collective memory. It doesn't vanish. It condenses. It hides in habits, in turns of phrase, in old stones that outlast sermons. And Paris, for all its amnesia, was still made of those stones. So the water waited, and when, centuries later, the first municipal baths were proposed, not as pleasure houses, but as public health necessities, they were met not with horror, but with weary relief. By then, the air was thick with coal smoke, the gutters overflowed, and the body, long perfumed and powdered, had begun to demand something simpler, something older, something honest. Water returned, not with trumpets or declarations, but with pipes and tiles, steam and space. And some said, as they soaked for the first time in clean, city-run tubs, that it felt like remembering. It was a Tuesday when Magda slipped on the wet planks outside the bathhouse and landed flat on her back. And the laughter that followed her fall echoed across the street like a choir of crows. Not cruel, just inevitable. Everyone slipped at the Badenhouse eventually. That's what happened when the steam poured out through every crack in the shutters, and the planks grew slick with moss and foot traffic. The bathhouse had become its own weather system in the center of the town square, hissing and breathing like something alive. It was 1322, and for the people of this particular German town, tucked between merchant roads and river curves, public bathing was not only accepted, it was expected. This was not Paris, where whispers of plague had begun to creep into the cathedral sermons. This was not an English village where priests frowned at the pleasures of the flesh. This was a town that still remembered Roman tiles beneath the soil, where water had always meant life. And gossip, especially gossip. The bathhouse was open 6 days a week. Sundays, the water was drained and the fire left cold. But every other day, you could find it alive by noon. Steam rising from its low roof. The smell of rosemary and beer yeast drifting downwind, and the sound of wood being split to feed the fires beneath the kettles. It was no marble hall. It was a timber-framed building with clay-chinked walls and a wide, sloping eave. But inside was a world apart. There were no divisions, no private rooms, just benches and basins. A central pool that never truly cooled, and a line of wooden tubs that could be filled with heated water on request. For a price. Men and women bathed at different hours mostly. But on feast days, on market days, on certain moon phases when superstition outweighed custom, the rules relaxed. And when the rules relaxed, so did the people. You didn't just bathe here. You spoke, you watched, you listened. The bathhouse was where marriages were whispered into motion, where affairs were suspected, where contracts were agreed upon just loudly enough to count as public. It was a place of rituals, not holy, not noble, but profoundly human. You took off your clothes, stepped into the steam, and let the water soften your aches and your lies. The town knew who washed and who didn't, not because anyone kept records, but because to skip the bathhouse too often was to step outside the rhythm of the place. It meant you had something to hide, or something you couldn't afford. Because even in a town where bathing was common, it was not always cheap. The coin to enter, the tip for the bucket boy, the cost of an extra scoop of lye or a handful of dried chamomile. If you couldn't pay, you waited until someone let you in on sympathy, or until the water cooled. Magda, who slipped that Tuesday, was a midwife. She carried her own soap. It smelled of onions, and no one liked it, but they tolerated it because they needed her hands. She bathed once a week, without fail, and when she did, she brought stories of births gone wrong, of births gone right, of women who whispered saints' names while pushing, and men who fainted when the first scream rang out. Her laugh shook the rafters. She slapped the water when amused. She had opinions about everything, and most of them were right. In the same bath, across the room, sat Herr Lenz, a merchant whose beard floated in the water like pondweed, and who believed that rinsing his face too often was bad luck. He came not to wash, but to watch. He would close his eyes and listen, not just to words, but to tone. A pause meant guilt. A laugh too loud meant invention. He built trade partnerships based on the way people sat in water, and he never did business with a man who kept his ankles above the surface. And then there were the bath attendants. They moved like dancers, barefoot, quick-footed, soaked to the knees. They refilled buckets, dumped the slop, stirred the kettles. They gossiped with each other when they thought no one listened, but everyone listened. Because in 1322 the bathhouse was the center of town, not by geography, but by gravity. It pulled everyone toward it eventually. The tanner with his stained hands, the baker with flour on her ankles, the priest who claimed to visit only to bless the water, and yet lingered just a little too long. It wasn't scandalous. Not yet. It was simply part of life. And yet, beneath the warmth and the chatter, something else lived in the corners. An unspoken awareness that this freedom was fragile, that the warmth might not last forever, that someday someone would say the steam was too sinful or the water too dangerous, that someday this world of bare feet and bold talk might be replaced by silence and suspicion. But on that Tuesday in 1322, as Magda laughed off her fall and slid into the tub with a grunt, none of that mattered. The steam curled upward. The water steamed gently, and the city, for one more afternoon, remembered what it was to bathe without fear. The water was always warmer in the afternoon, not because the fires burned hotter. They didn't, but because by then, the tubs had been used, the walls had soaked in the steam, and the air itself had learned to sweat. People arrived slower after lunch, weighed down by bread and beer, and the bathhouse took on a different rhythm. The morning rush of washers and whisperers gave way to something quieter, softer, kind of communal exhale that filled the air between every bucket splash and drawn-out sigh. Magda was still there, of course. She stayed longer than most. Midwives could. They weren't bound by guild rules or market bells. They belonged to no trade, but were needed by all. She floated near the corner, her arms draped over the smooth rim of the basin, her fingers wrinkled and pink from soaking. Now and then she reached out and scooped water over her shoulder, not to wash, but to remind her skin that it was being held by something warmer than the world outside. The bathhouse had no clocks, but everyone knew when it was mid-afternoon. That was when Petra, the butcher's daughter, always arrived with her mother's apron still tied over her skirt and a sack of dried lavender in hand. She never paid to enter. Her father provided the bathhouse with lard for soap making, and the keeper allowed her free access in return. She would untie her boots slowly, hang her tunic on a nail by the door, and slip into the heat like someone returning to a memory. She didn't speak much, but everyone watched her, because Petra remembered things. She remembered who said what and when, who showed up together and left separately, who blushed too easily or not enough. She didn't gossip. She didn't need to. She simply held the knowledge until someone was foolish enough to lie in her presence. That day she sat beside a young blacksmith's apprentice who had been boasting, too loudly, too often, about the silver bracelet he had gifted to the brewer's niece. Petra raised one eyebrow, tilted her head slightly, and said nothing. The boy sank lower into the water, and the conversation shifted without effort. No shame, no scolding, just the quiet rebalancing that happened when truth surfaced in a place where nothing could be hidden. Because that was the nature of the bathhouse. You were exposed, not just in body, but in being. You couldn't hide behind titles or trade. The water didn't care if you were rich or poor, married or not, respected or whispered about. It treated everyone the same, stripped them down, wrapped them in steam, and invited them to sit with their stories floating silently between them. It was why some people came every week, and why others never returned. Trust was an odd currency in places like this. It wasn't earned by honesty. It was earned by showing up, again and again, by being willing to strip off your coat, your boots, your mask, and let your shoulders sink below the water without fear. Those who could do that, who didn't flinch when their feet touched someone else's knee, who didn't stiffen when their name was said too casually, became part of the rhythm. Their presence reassured others. Their absence was noted. Even the keeper of the bathhouse, an older woman named Lean, who said very little and charged very little more, knew who belonged. She never turned anyone away, but she made her thoughts known with a glance. If she liked you, she handed you the better soap. If she didn't, you got the old rag and a nod toward the cold tub. No one argued with Lean. She had seen too much. She knew which visitors tipped too much and why, which travelers took longer than necessary, and what that meant, which wives came alone more often than was explained. But she kept her knowledge like steam, rising, then gone. That afternoon, as the air thickened and the windows ran with condensation, Lean poured a ladle of hot water into a girl's basin and whispered, "This is the last good heat today." The girl nodded. Everyone understood. Wood was finite. Fire burned down. And in 1322, warmth was not wasted. As the water cooled, the tone shifted again. People rinsed slower. Conversations dimmed. A man near the corner began humming an old folk tune no one had heard in years. Someone laughed, softly, kindly, and others joined in, not with words, just with the kind of breath that carries memory. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was close. In the fading heat of that bathhouse, bodies remembered things they hadn't felt in months. Relief, closeness, the ache of ease. The walls absorbed it. The planks underfoot groaned gently with every step. No one reached for their towels just yet. Because even as the warmth faded, the trust remained. And trust, in 1322, was as rare as soap. By twilight, the bathhouse was quiet again. Not empty, just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when the steam starts to cool and voices grow low, not out of fear, but fatigue. The air, once dense with the sound of splashing water and light chatter, now held only the slow drip of condensation falling from the rafters, the occasional slosh of water poured from one bucket into another, and the rustle of linen being folded with tired fingers. The regulars had gone, the talkative ones, the watchers, and the remembered. Even Magda, who always stayed the longest, had slipped into her boots and disappeared into the evening mist with nothing more than a grunt and a wave. Her laugh no longer echoed off the tile. The space felt different without it. Lean, the keeper, moved slowly now, barefoot on the damp planks, her toes numb from standing too long. She lifted a basin and poured what little warmth remained into the side drain, her hands steady, her face unreadable. This was the part of the day no one saw unless they stayed too long. The undoing, the closing, the careful winding down of something communal and ancient and fragile. One man remained, old, thin, with skin like parchment and a back curved, not from age, but from labor. He sat alone in one of the smaller tubs, the water level low, his knees sticking out like awkward elbows turned sideways. He wasn't there for gossip, never had been. Lee knew his kind, the ones who came not to talk, not to watch, not to play social games, but to remember. He came every third day, like clockwork, never missed a visit unless the river froze too hard. Pay exactly the right coin, never more, never less. Sat in the same tub, stayed just long enough to soak the cold from his bones. He never asked for hot water, never accepted soap, but he washed his hands slowly, carefully, as if they were something he wasn't quite done using. As Lean poured the last ladle of hot water onto the floor to rinse the boards, he finally spoke. Used to be louder in here. Lean didn't reply right away. She knew not all statements needed answers. She folded a towel, hung a cloth, doused the hearth. Only then did she say, "Maybe folks have less to say these days." He nodded, not because he agreed, but because he knew the conversation had already ended. That's how it was here. The bathhouse spoke for itself. Its walls knew too many names to whisper them all aloud. Its benches carried stories soaked deep into the grain. Lovers had sat here. Enemies, too. Midwives. Drunks. Merchants who lied about what they sold and women who wept without saying why. All of them equal once the water touched their skin. This room had seen fevers break and friendships begin. And yes, it had seen scandal. Everyone pretended it hadn't, but everyone knew. There were nights, especially in summer, when the rules grew thin and bodies stayed too close for modesty, when a laugh became a whisper and a whisper became something more. That was part of the rhythm, too. Steam did strange things to memory. It softened edges, made people speak more freely than they should. And some bathhouses, especially in bigger towns, were known more for the company than the water. But this place, this was different. Not purer, not cleaner, just older. And it remembered. As Lean snuffed the last of the candles, she looked around the room, at the darkened tubs, the damp floor, the slowly swirling mist that clung to the corners. She thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that water could carry so much. Not just dirt, not just heat, but stories. Every bucket poured was a small erasure. Cleansing. And yet nothing was ever truly gone. The old man stood, wrapped himself in linen, left without a word, and Lane followed, locking the door behind her, leaving the inside to cool. By morning, it would smell of ash and mildew. The floorboards would creak with cold. Dubs would be dry and waiting, and sometime after noon, the first knock would come. Gentle, tentative. Familiar? Because even in 1322, people needed more than food and coin and rest. They needed the warmth of shared silence. They needed water that had touched other bodies and still welcomed theirs. They needed to be seen without armor. And for one more day they had been. It started behind the ears. That was usually where they made their home first, nestled in the warmth just beneath the hairline, where sweat pooled on hot days and wool scarves rubbed on cold ones. A slow itch. Not painful, just present, persistent. The kind of discomfort that grew in silence until one day, while pulling at a scab or scratching a neck too hard, you noticed it. A speck. A twitch. A tiny movement too fast for dust. You'd caught a louse. Or more likely, you already had dozens. For a medieval peasant, this was nothing new. It was normal. Expected. Inevitable. It wasn't a sign of poor hygiene. Not really. It was a sign of being alive and among people. Lice didn't need filth to survive. They needed warmth and fabric and close quarters, all of which the peasant class had in abundance. Families lived in single rooms, sometimes a dozen to a house. Animals slept in the same space. Blankets were shared. Hats were passed down. Bathing was rare. Washing clothes was rarer. And lice, like all things small and determined, thrived where people gathered and lingered and sweated through winter. The peasants had names for them. Familiar, even affectionate names. God's little soldiers, some called them for their persistence. Breadcrumbs that bite back, joked the grandmothers when they picked them from their grandsons' collars. They were not feared, not hated, only managed. They were picked out by hand, squeezed between fingernails, flung into the hearth, sometimes caught in a linen comb and scraped into a bowl of vinegar, sometimes ignored until a feast or festival, when appearance mattered more than comfort. Hair was rarely cut short, except in monasteries. Children might be shaved once a year, but adults rarely bothered. Long hair kept you warm. It was a badge of age and strength. It could be tied up, braided, or wrapped in cloth, but it could not be spared for the sake of an itch. So they lived with it, with the louse, with its cousins, the flea, the mite, the burrowing tick that clung to ankles and thighs after a morning in the fields. These creatures were not separate from life. They were part of its fabric. Soap, if you had any, was too precious to waste on hair. It was saved for laundry, or illness, or childbirth. Hair was rinsed in rainwater when possible, brushed with stiff straw bundles, occasionally treated with strong-smelling herbs. Rosemary, wormwood, yarrow. Not to clean, but to confuse the pests. To drive them out with smell. To mask yourself for a day or two until they found their way back. Itching was just background noise. People scratched while walking, while threshing, while praying. No one stared when someone pulled off a bonnet to scratch the scalp. No one asked questions when a child squirmed and groaned and clawed at their neck. It was the hum of the body in motion. The sound of life being lived too close to other bodies and too far from convenience. There were worse things than lice. Infections, fevers, rotting teeth, boils that swelled under the arms and meant the end before a priest could be fetched. Compared to that, a few crawling things in the seams of your shirt were manageable. Still, they noticed the difference in seasons. In summer, the louse multiplied. Warmth made it bold. Bodies sweated more. Blankets were traded for straw mats, and even then, the little creatures found their way beneath the fabric. In winter, things quieted. The cold slowed their movement. Layers of wool and linen provided refuge, but also barriers. For a few short months, the itching dulled, but it never left. Every peasant family had rituals, not the kind kept in books, but passed through gesture and instinct. On feast days, they washed their hands, combed their hair, and boiled their underclothes, if they could spare the firewood. Old shirts were hung out in the wind with vinegar-soaked scraps pinned to the cuffs. Some swore that if you whispered a prayer while boiling water with tansy, the lice would fall dead in the corners of the pot. Others slept with sprigs of lavender under their pillows. Not to keep the lice out, but to sleep better through the scratching. And then there were the lice pickers. Usually grandmothers or older children, tasked with sitting behind you and carefully parting the hair, nail by nail, until the offenders were found and crushed. It was slow work, tedious, but it was the closest thing to grooming most peasants experience. There was something strangely comforting in it. The warmth of another's knees against your back, the soft mutterings of complaint and gossip, the occasional slap when a head jerked too fast. These were moments of closeness, of care, not glamorous, not clean, but human. In this world, hygiene was not a goal. It was a rhythm, an act of survival. The body was never spotless, never scentless, never still. It moved. It flaked and cracked and healed again. And within its folds and creases, life grew. Sometimes unwanted, but not always feared. Because even a louse, they said, needed warmth. And warmth, in the medieval countryside, was worth more than comfort. The linens told the real story. Not the fine embroidered stuff kept in manor chests for dowries and holy days, but the working linen, the undercloths, the shifts, the night wraps, the inner tunics. These were the garments closest to the skin, and they bore the history of every hour lived inside them. Sweat soaked into them before it reached the outer wool. Skin sloughed off into their threads. And between those fibers, always tucked in the seams, the folds, the collar edges, lived the louse. It was in the linens that the cycle was clearest. Clean them, and you could buy a day or two of comfort. Maybe more if the weather stayed dry. But wait too long, and the fabric turned into a nest. Warm, dark, still, exactly what a louse wanted. So families took to hanging linen near the hearth, not only to dry it, but to smoke the bugs out. Others hung it outside, hoping the wind would chill the lice into falling off. And some, especially those with older grannies, resorted to turning the cloth inside out and heating it near the coals, not to burn it, but to trick the lice into crawling toward the light, where they could be pinched and snapped. Every woman knew the signs. The crawling sensation at the nape of the neck, the sharp little bite behind the knee, the rustling noise when you shook a tunic too fast. They didn't scream. They didn't even sigh. They just moved to the fire, grabbed a comb, and began again. Peasants didn't worry about being clean the way we might define it. They worried about being livable. If the shirt didn't stink, and the lice weren't too aggressive, and the skin beneath it wasn't bleeding, then it was good enough. After all, there were fields to be worked, goats to be milked, bread to be baked. No one had time to fret about tiny invaders when hunger, debt, and weather made far louder demand. That didn't mean they were careless. It meant they were practical. Bathing, when it happened, was often a response to infestation. Not comfort. Not beauty. When a child couldn't sleep from scratching, or a man came back from the woods with crawling legs, or a woman bled behind her ears from too much digging, that was when you boiled the water. You didn't soak for luxury. You soaked for relief. And you did it in stages. First the hair, then the feet, then the underarms if there was water left. Soap, if you had it, was saved for the truly filthy spots, between the toes, the base of the back, the groin. Everything else was scrubbed with old cloth and hot vinegar. And still, when you dried off and dressed again, there was a good chance 1 or 2 lice had survived. They always did. That was their nature. They knew how to hide. They were better at surviving poverty than the people who bore them. Children accepted them before they knew the words to complain. Babies cried at the itch but didn't understand its source. Only around age 6 or 7 did a child learn how to scratch just right. Not too hard to bleed. Not too soft to be pointless. And by then, they had already passed lice to everyone in their family twice over. People joked about it. They had to. They told stories of lice that grew so large they could be saddled, of fleas that carried love letters between lovers, of a woman whose hair was so thick her lice held court in it. It was humor, but it was also defiance. If you could laugh at your discomfort, then it didn't own you. If you could name your louse, then it wasn't shameful. Shame wasn't reserved for the poor. Even wealth couldn't keep lice away. Nobles had more clothes, more changes of linen, more servants to clean them. But they still scratched. Their collars still crawled. Their powdered wigs became entire ecosystems. But they paid others to handle it. Lice picking became a task for servants, a quiet duty carried out behind chamber doors. No one spoke of it. No one admitted it. Peasants, on the other hand, had no need for denial. They combed lice out of each other's hair in public, by the fire, beside the door. They scratched while speaking, swatted while working. It was not impolite. It was survival. And it wasn't hidden. This, perhaps, was the difference. For the peasant, lice were not a sign of failing. They were a feature of the world. Like rain, or wind, or taxes. You endured them, you managed them, and you passed down the knowledge of how. In the end, you simply learned to live with them, not out of surrender, but out of rhythm. The way a farmer lives with rain that never falls quite when it's needed. The way a woman lives with the ache in her back that never fully goes away. The way a family learns to eat less in spring when the larder grows thin. In the medieval village, life was not something you perfected. It was something you endured. And lice, with their silent tenacity, their knack for hiding in the folds of collars and the seams of sleeping sacks, became just another companion on the long walk of survival. Most didn't even flinch anymore. The scratching was so constant it barely registered. Only when it grew fierce, when the skin broke, when sleep was lost, when infection festered, did someone take notice. And even then, the response wasn't dramatic. There was no panic, no horror, just movement. Heat water, find vinegar, borrow the comb, sit by the fire and let someone dig through your hair like they were tending a garden in need of weeding. It wasn't tender, but it wasn't cruel either. It was maintenance. Lice lived with you, the way mice lived in the grain bins, the way mold grew near the well in rainy months, the way splinters wedged into your hands and never quite left. The itch of the louse was not just on the skin, it was in the fabric of the world. And peasants understood that more clearly than anyone else, because they couldn't pretend it wasn't there. That honesty, uncomfortable, itchy, but real, defined much of their relationship with the body. They did not expect their bodies to feel good. Not often. They didn't expect comfort. They expected calluses, heat rashes, wounds that took weeks to close, nails that cracked, teeth that ached. But they also expected the body to keep going, and it usually did. So when the church preached about purity of the soul, most peasants nodded and continued picking lice from their child's tunic. When the nobles cloaked themselves in perfume and powdered wigs and whispered that filth was a moral failing, the peasants pulled their hoods tighter and boiled their shirts when they had enough firewood. There was no shame. There was no illusion. There was only living. And lice lived too. They reminded you that you were warm, that you were breathing, that your skin was still feeding something, even if you didn't want it to. They moved when you moved. They traveled with you. They waited. They returned. And when you had the time and the means, you smoked them out again, boiled your clothes, sat by the hearth, and let someone you trusted reach into your hair and pull them out one by one. It was care, not in the way we might define it today, but in the way that mattered back then. A mother picking lice from her child's head while murmuring a lullaby, a sister sharing the better comb, a husband turning the mattress before bed to check for nests. These were small acts, quiet ones, but they were acts of dignity, of attention, of preservation in a world that left so little space for comfort. The lice never left for good. They always came back, but so did the people. They returned to the hearth, to the basin, to each other. And that, more than anything, is what kept the world moving. Not the absence of discomfort, but the willingness to share it, to scratch and comb and rinse and laugh in the face of it, to be human, fully, itchy, tired, and endlessly enduring. It grew long because it had to. There were no salons, no scissors and drawers beside polished mirrors, no barbers with scented oils ready to wash and trim and pat you dry. If you lived in 1950, hair, especially if you were a woman, was something grown, not managed. It was a natural fabric, thick and layered, passed down through generations like a family trait, and left mostly to its own devices. It was a covering, a burden, a symbol, and above all, it was not washed often. That wasn't out of laziness. It wasn't even out of ignorance. It was simply a matter of practicality. Washing hair, truly washing it, meant more than just pouring water over your head. It meant heating enough water to soak it through, then finding something to scrub it with, then finding the time and warmth to dry it before the cold took hold. In the year of 150, where open fires smoked more than they burned, where water had to be fetched by hand and soap was often reserved for cloth or hands, hair washing became a ritual performed rarely, with caution, and sometimes with dread. For most peasants, the answer to hair hygiene was not cleansing. It was containment. Hair was tied, braided, wrapped, coiled, pinned, covered with wimples or veils, or scraps of cloth that had once been the edge of a bedsheet. Men tied it back, especially if it grew past the ears. Boys wore it shaggy, uncut, half-managed until someone took a knife to it during Lent. But washing, that was something you did a handful of times a year, if that. And yet, somehow, it functioned. The body, in its stubborn, miraculous way, adapted. Scalps became less oily when not scrubbed constantly. Hair that wasn't stripped of its natural oils began to self-regulate. Brushing, done with carved combs made from horn or wood, lifted dirt and redistributed oils. People learned which herbs helped. Vinegar rinses were common in wealthier households. Rosemary boiled in water and poured over the scalp could mask the worst of it. But mostly you endured. You endured the heaviness of unwashed hair, the way it clung to your neck after work, the itch along the parting line, the mats that formed when you slept too long without wrapping it. You combed it when you could, and you learned not to run your fingers through it unless you wanted a handful of residue. People didn't describe hair as dirty back then. They described it as tired, as heavy. When a woman said she needed to tend her hair, it meant more than just styling. It meant time, effort, the work of managing something that never fully rested. something that continued to grow even when the body was hungry. Hair could be a source of pride, of course. Braids were practical but also beautiful. Even among the poor girls wore ribbons when they could. A strip of dyed wool woven through a plait. A carved pin gifted on a saint's day. These small adornments mattered, because when you couldn't afford soap or leisure, you dressed your hair instead. But even among the noble classes, where servants could draw hot water and bring cloths soaked in herbs, hair washing remained infrequent. A noble woman in the 50 might wash her hair every few weeks, perhaps in preparation for a feast or a religious festival. Even then, she'd likely do it in parts. A rinse near the scalp, a rub of scented oil at the ends, a slow brushing afterward while seated near the fire, her maid pulling the comb through, slowly, carefully, removing lice and dust and tangles one stroke at a time. There were no shampoos, no conditioners. The oils used came from animal fat or pressed plants, and they were used more for scent than for cleansing. Sometimes ashes were mixed with water and poured over the scalp, then wiped away. Sometimes beer was used. Yes, beer. Not for the smell, but for the yeast, which softened the hair and discouraged some of the bugs. But even with all of that, most people didn't wash their hair for weeks. And when they finally did, it felt like a reset. The water ran dark with dirt. The smell changed. The scalp, exposed again to air and touch, felt raw, tender, like a wound healing. They didn't rush the drying. They sat near the fire. They wrapped towels around their heads and pressed, not rubbed, until the weight of wet hair became manageable again. That's what hair meant in the 150. Not vanity, not fashion, but maintenance, and a deep awareness of when the body needed tending. And so the question wasn't really how long could you go without washing it. It was instead, how long could you ignore it before it began to speak? The comb was everything. If hair couldn't be washed, it had to be worked. Every household, no matter how poor, kept at least one comb, usually made of horn or carved wood, passed down through generations, worn soft along the teeth. They were never ornate. They didn't need to be. Their worth was in the way they moved through tangled roots, the way they scraped the scalp just enough to stir circulation, the way they caught what water couldn't: dust, soot, bugs, flakes of skin, and the hair that had given up and let go. Hair was always being let go in the Middle Ages. Stress, malnutrition, seasonal shifts, these left their mark. It wasn't uncommon to find more in the comb than on the head, and no one seemed surprised by it. Hair loss was part of living. So was hair dulling, drying, matting into places it shouldn't be. And yet, every few days, people sat, often by firelight, often in silence, and combed. Not for beauty, not even for cleanliness, but for function. It was a strange intimacy, one that didn't require words. Mothers combed daughters. Sisters combed each other. A man might sit between his wife's knees while she worked through his knots, neither of them speaking, just letting the comb do its work. The scraping sound became a kind of rhythm in the household. The thud of boots at the door, the hiss of broth in a pot, the pull of a comb through hair. Brushing wasn't rushed. It couldn't be. Hair that hadn't been washed in weeks needed patience. You couldn't tug too fast, or the scalp would tear. You couldn't brush it dry, or the static would turn the whole task into a battle. So you combed slowly, from end to root, over and over. And when you were finished, you oiled it. The oil wasn't luxury. It was necessity, made from what was available. Goose fat rendered tallow, the pressings of herbs soaked in wine or vinegar, sometimes rosemary, if it could be spared, sometimes nettle, sometimes garlic, if you believed in its protective strength. The point wasn't scent. It was survival. The oil gave the hair weight again, kept it from snapping, kept the lice at bay, at least a little, kept the wind from splitting it apart. The oil was always rubbed in by hand. Fingers worked into the scalp, massaging it in slow circles, often without words. Often after dinner, when the light had dimmed and the chores were done. It was one of the few physical comforts peasants had. This small, shared ritual of care that came not from wealth or instruction, but from sheer, weathered habit. Some women believed their hair held memory, that it was wrong to cut it unless someone had died, that it carried the stories of the body it grew from. They said dreams lived in the long strands and should not be taken lightly. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. They believed it, so they protected it. Others feared it. Hair was powerful, magical, dangerous. Cut it the wrong way, and it could bring misfortune. Let it fall into the wrong hands, and it could be used against you, woven into charms or curses. That's why when someone did cut their hair, out of grief or rebellion or sickness, it was burned or buried, never thrown out. Hair was never just hair. Even the church understood this. That's why nuns cut it, why monks shaved it, why women covered it, why men grew it to signal status, and then shaved it again to show humility. It was a language, a map, a sign. And washing it? That was a kind of ritual, too. When it happened, it changed things. People noticed, even if they didn't say so. The hair lay flatter. It shone more. It smelled faintly of the water it had touched. River, rain, or boiled herbs. It moved differently when braided. It slept differently against the skin. In noble households, hair washing was a longer process, but not frequent. A young lady might wash her hair once every month, more if she was unwell, or preparing for a feast, or being courted. It would take hours. Heated water brought in buckets, sheets laid out to soak the excess, pendants to brush and separate, to pour and catch, to dry and wrap. By the end, the lady would be exhausted, but she would feel for a moment like something lifted, not just from her scalp, but from herself. Even peasants felt it, when they could manage it. That strange lightness, the cold rush, the shock of your own head, no longer wrapped in dirt and habit. For a few hours you felt your skin breathe again. And then, of course, it returned. The wind, the work, the sweat, the bugs. Hair went back to being what it had always been. A part of the body too stubborn to control and too sacred to ignore. So you combed it again, oiled it again, and waited until it asked to be washed. And only then, only when the weight of weeks could no longer be brushed out, you filled the basin, dipped your head, and remembered what it was like to feel the scalp beneath the hair. When it finally came, when the water was boiled, the wind was still, and the time was right. It wasn't a celebration. It was a necessity. The day someone in the household washed their hair was usually marked not with joy, but with planning. The task came after the bread had been baked, after the animals had been seen to, after the floors had been swept and the sky had stayed dry long enough to trust it. It was not the kind of thing you did on impulse. You did not simply decide to wash your hair in 1150. You prepared for it. The basin was brought inside, larger than the one used for hands, wider than the one used for feet. It had to hold the water and the weight of the hair itself, which, after months unwashed, had grown into something heavy. The water was heated over coals, not a full boil, but warm enough to loosen what clung to the scalp. Dust, oil, residue, the invisible buildup of weeks spent sweating beneath linen and wool. The room was closed off, windows shuttered, curtains pulled, not because the act was shameful, but because it was vulnerable. Washing the hair exposed more than the head. It left the neck bare. It left the spine unguarded. And most of all, it made you still in a world that rarely allowed stillness. If you were lucky, someone helped you. A sister, a mother, a husband with quiet hands. They poured water slowly, carefully, over your crown, catching the runoff in cloths. No splashing, no waste. Water was precious, and the firewood it had taken to heat it could not be taken for granted. Then came the combing, not dry this time, but through the damp strands, knot by knot, pulling the weight out of each one. It hurt. It always hurt. Hair pulled like that always did. But it also relieved something. It uncoiled what the weeks had tightened. And then the oil. Even if it was just a drop of goose fat melted between the palms. Something to return softness, to smooth what had been pulled too hard. You sat by the fire until it dried, hours sometimes, with a cloth across your shoulders, and your head bowed forward to let the heat creep in. No one rushed it. You couldn't. To rush would mean damp hair overnight, and dampness brought illness. So you sat, listened to the fire, listened to your own breath again. Now that the itch was gone, and the weight was changed. Children sometimes fell asleep like that, wrapped in blankets, hair still damp, heads resting against knees. Their hair, when clean, looked like something new had grown on them. Shiny, yes, but also lighter, as if they could walk taller without the invisible burden of unwashed days pressing down. Adults didn't smile much after hair washing. They sat quiet, tired, more themselves. You could feel the difference in the room after it was done. The air smelled like heat and vinegar, like rosemary and skin. The basin sat in the corner, water gone dark and cloudy. No one poured it out until the next morning. Letting it cool overnight was practical, but also respectful. You didn't rush it away. You let it rest too. And the next day, the world began again. Hair was tied back, wrapped, covered. The old headscarves were pulled tight. Work resumed. Ash settled back into the corners of the floor. But there was always that lingering feeling, the memory of water on your head, buns in your hair, of heat rising along your neck. It faded, of course. Everything did. The wind returned. The sweat returned. The light came back. But the body remembered. And it held that memory, somewhere deep in the roots, like a quiet truth, that even in a world that never stopped moving, you had stopped. You had been held. You had been rinsed. And for a little while, at least, you had been clean. Not in the eyes of saints or scribes, but in your own skin. And that was enough. The armor shone brighter than the man inside it. That was the unspoken rule of the field. Gleam before grit, polish before preparation. A knight, especially one of name and land, might not know the weight of a hammer or the ache of a saddle sore, but he knew what his mail looked like at sunrise. His squires made certain of it. They sanded it, scrubbed it, rubbed it with waxes and oil. His sword was sharpened daily. His boots were buffed to a deep brown. The leather beneath his breastplate was conditioned until it sighed with suppleness. But his skin, hidden under layers of wool, linen, leather, steel, was another matter entirely. Sir Aldrich was one such knight. Tall, broad, with a nose broken more from sport than war, and a laugh too loud for a chapel. He carried himself with all the confidence expected of a land-downing man who had once fought at the edge of real battle and survived. He was not cruel, nor foolish. He was, in the way of many of his peers, merely convinced of a hierarchy in which dirt was part of valor. A knight too clean, after all, must not be doing his duty. What use was a polished face when your sword arm was strong? He bathed once a year, always in spring, always in a tub brought into the great hall and filled by buckets carried in from the well. It was a tradition, half rite, half spectacle. The villagers whispered about it, the squires prepared for it, and the knight himself endured it like penance. He joked about it, of course, called it his chivalric soak, said he did it for the morale of the household. But the truth was simpler. It was the only time the armor came off without war, and the only time his body reminded him it was still his. The rest of the year, Aldrich trusted to linen and scent. Linen, because it could be changed. The underlayers he wore beneath his mail, long tunics of soft cloth, were his shield against the filth of his own making. They absorbed the sweat. They caught the blood. They yellowed in the creases and stiffened at the cuffs. His squires laundered them when the stench grew too sharp, usually by boiling and beating them with ash soap and sticks. No one expected the linen to be spotless, only tolerable, and scent, because it masked what could not be scrubbed. Lavender in the corners of his gloves, sage rubbed into the neck of his doublet. He once received a pouch of dried orange peel and cloves from a merchant's daughter, and carried it for months until the cloth turned dark with oil. He liked how it made his sleeves smell when he lifted his arms in court. Water, though, real water, was a thing apart. Aldrich distrusted it, not because he was afraid of getting wet, but because he had grown up believing what many knights did, that bathing softened the limbs, that it opened the pores and let the cold inside, that it made you vulnerable in the one place you were meant to be strongest, your skin. He had seen squires fall ill after a plunge in a river. He had seen men tremble in fever after a hasty soak. He had heard enough physicians talk of humors and vapors to know that water was not to be trusted. Besides, armor made bathing nearly impossible. You couldn't disrobe casually when your clothing came in layers and buckles and straps. A full removal took time. It took hands. It took space. And once removed, you were exposed, not just to air, but to weakness. So Aldrich did what knights did. He sweated beneath the mail. He scratched at his scalp. He wiped the salt from his brow with his gauntlet. He bathed once, and called it discipline. But beneath the linen, beneath the oiled seams and softened tunics, his skin told another story. Red patches where the armor rubbed raw jot, flecks of blood on his thighs from endless rides, a rash that flared along his shoulders after every long campaign, a sore near his elbow that never fully closed. He never showed them. To do so would be to admit that the body needed tending. And tending was not chivalric. Chivalry was duty, sacrifice, steel that gleamed even when the flesh beneath it festered. So Aldrich laughed off the stink, bragged about his annual bath like a badge, told his squires that the only thing water cleaned was your courage. And yet, each spring, when the tub was brought into the great hall, and the room was cleared and the water was poured hot, not scalding, he sat in it longer than necessary, alone, silent, out, soaking not just the dirt from his skin, but the ache from his years. And as the steam curled around him, he wondered, not aloud, never aloud, what it might feel like to bathe again before the year was done. Beneath the weight of his titles and his chainmail and his endless proclamations of duty, Sir Aldrich itched. Not a small itch, not an idle scratch behind the ear or a passing nuisance along the scalp. What? This was the deep, persistent itch that crept behind the knees, under the arms, across the spine where the padded coif pressed tightly against the neck and never quite dried. The kind of itch that lived with you, that whispered during council meetings and hissed during long rides and roared in silence once the feasting stopped and the fire burned low. But still he bore it. That too was part of the role. The other knights rarely mentioned it, but they knew. You could see it in the way they leaned too often against stone walls, shifting their weight, adjusting their tunics just slightly when the squire wasn't looking. Some wore extra padding. Others took to dusting their chests with ground chalk and herbs. But the solution was always surface level. Armor was permanence. Din was inconvenience. And so, Baldric endured, because that was what he had been trained to do. When he was a boy, the old knight who trained him, a wiry man with clouded eyes and a voice like gravel, had taught him that a knight was measured by three things: how he rode, how he fought, and how long he could suffer without complaint. Bathing was not on the list. Comfort was never mentioned. You were told to stand until your knees gave, to eat only after the men below you had been fed, to bleed without flinching, and to ride through winter without more than a single complaint. And so, Baldric learned to carry discomfort like a blade strapped to his side. Always there, never discussed. Still, he noticed things. He noticed when his horse shied from the smell of his leather jerkin, when servants changed the bedclothes more often after his campaigns, when the squires rolled their eyes but only when his back was turned. He saw how the women at court leaned away slightly when he stood too near. They never said it aloud. They didn't have to. But Baldric was not cruel. He took pride in his appearance, not for vanity, but for what it represented. A knight's appearance was the face of order, the shield of tradition. So he adjusted where he could. He had his linens changed more often, his gloves rubbed with rosemary. He began wiping his scalp with vinegar-soaked cloths in private, a trick a healer had taught him during a long siege. He still wouldn't bathe. Not yet. But he was not without awareness. Still, the itch remained. It followed him through tournaments, through council, through vigils. It flared in the spring beneath his armor and crawled up his spine in the summer heat. It made him sit a little crooked in the saddle and lean harder into his sword when training squires. Once it grew so bad he found a priest, not for confession, but for poultice. The priest, half blind and tired, handed him a paste that smelled of pine sap and old lard. Baldric used it. Twice. It helped. Then he threw it away. Because it felt like cheating. Because chivalry, for all its grandness, was built on grit. He never admitted how much he envied the washerwomen. Not for their labor, but for their permission. They were allowed to handle the body, to scrub and scrape and reach into places knights could not acknowledge. They were earthy, yes, but also free. No one expected them to be noble while they worked. They could grunt and complain and sweat and scratch. Baldric had no such luxury. He wore his discomfort the way he wore his cloak, draped across him, dignified in public, weighted in private. He remembered once, in a smaller village, when a child pointed at him and asked why the night smelled like the pigsty. The mother shushed the boy. Baldric smiled, said nothing, and later spent an hour scrubbing his armor even though it was already clean. The smell, after all, came not from the steel, but from the man inside it. And still he waited for spring, that once-a-year moment when he could soak without shame, when the tub would be filled, when the room would be cleared, when the fire would be stoked high, and he would finally remove it all. Not just the armor, but the story he wore over his skin. And in the meantime, he endured the itch, and told himself it was the price of valor. When the day finally arrived, there was no announcement. Just the sound of splashing in the courtyard well before dawn, the shuffle of boots on stone, and the quiet thud of firewood being stacked beneath the copper basin in the great hall. The tub, so rarely used it required wiping down twice, was set in the center of the flagstones, far from the hearth but close enough for the heat to reach it. No one said a word, but everyone knew what it meant. Once a year, always in early spring, just before the lambing started, and just after the frost gave way to mud, Sir Aldrich bathed. The squires took it seriously. It was one of the few duties that made them feel almost noble themselves. Drawing water, heating it in kettles, pouring it with care, placing sprigs of rosemary and pine needles near the rim as if preparing for a knight's funeral rather than his annual. So there was no ceremony, no prayer. But there was something reverent about the way the air changed. How the smell of steam and wet stone crept up the stairwells and softened the morning light. Aldrich descended alone. He did not wear his armor. Only a simple tunic, stained from years of wear, sleeves already rolled. He carried no sword, no crest, no gloves. His hair was tied back, his boots unlaced, his face unreadable. The hall was cleared, save for one squire who remained near the wall, eyes lowered, in case help was needed pouring the last of the water. The knight said nothing. He stepped into the tub, slowly, one foot then the other, and sat. The water reached only to his waist, but it was enough. It was always enough. There was no sigh of relief, no theatrical groan, just stillness. Steam rose around his shoulders, wrapping him in a mist that blurred the lines between man and myth. For once, his body was not a symbol. It was just a body, one with bruises along the thigh, scars behind the ribs, raw patches near the knees, one that had aged more quickly than he liked to admit, one that, for most of the year, was pressed beneath iron and expectation. He didn't scrub right away. He just sat, let the heat crawl into his joints, let the ache lift a little, let the itch fade, not all the way, but enough to remember what stillness felt like. Then he dipped his hands into the basin, brought water to his face, wiped the skin just below his eyes, just behind his ears, carefully, as if he feared washing something away that might not come back. The squire approached quietly, placed a cloth on the rim, backed away. Aldrich took it. He worked slowly, shoulders, chest, arms, not aggressively, not as a man scrubbing dirt, but as a man reacquainting himself with what lay beneath. The linen turned darker with each pass. The smell shifted. Less sweat, more ash and wet iron. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, just real. By the time the water cooled, he had stopped moving. His hands rested on his thighs, his head bowed, not in prayer, not in shame, just in quiet. And in that silence, something settled. Not guilt, not regret, just recognition that for most of the year, he had lived inside a shell, a symbol, a story. But in this moment, he was only a man with cracked heels and a healing cut beneath his left shoulder blade. A man who remembered the warmth of water the way some remember song. He stepped out slowly, wrapped himself in a robe without embroidery, let the squire pour the water out back into the garden, the steam rising one last time into the morning air. And then he dressed, in fresh linen, in soft wool, not in armor, not yet. He would wear it again, of course. He would strap it on for the tournaments, for the processions, for the feasts where his name meant protection. But for a few hours longer, he let the weight rest elsewhere. And as he walked back up the stone steps to his chamber, hair still damp, footsteps soft, the castle felt different. Not because it had changed, but because he had remembered something most nights never spoke of. That beneath the legend, the man still lived. And sometimes, even once a year, he needed to feel that, even if no one else would ever know. It didn't smell clean. That was the first thing most people noticed about soap in the Middle Ages. It wasn't floral. It wasn't fresh. It didn't smell like lavender fields or lemon groves or anything that hinted at grace. It smelled like fat, like fire, like something boiled and beaten into submission. It was sharp, chalky, sour at times, and it left your skin feeling more scoured than soothed. But if you were lucky enough to have a lump of it, raw, brown, and slightly sticky to the touch, you kept it close. Because whatever its scent, it had power, and people respected what they didn't entirely understand. Soap, as it existed in the 12th century, was not a daily item. It wasn't a convenience. It was a craft, a risk, and in some corners of Europe, it was viewed with faint suspicion. To use soap was to meddle with transformation, to turn grease into foam, ash into cleansing. That kind of alchemy, performed without blessing, using ingredients gathered from death and waste, was unsettling. The basic recipe was simple, but brutal. You needed fat, animal fat, usually mutton or beef tallow, left over from butchery, scraped from bones, stored in waxed cloth or pots until the smell grew sour. Then you needed lye, which was not bought in markets but made by soaking ashes in water and draining the runoff. This liquid burned. It could sear skin, blind eyes, eat holes through cloth. Yet when you mixed it with fat, boiled it for long enough, stirred it with care, you ended up with something strange, thick, pasty, hardening at the edges. The people who made it were not always trusted. Soap makers often worked outside town walls, near streams, and away from bakeries and churches. The smell alone was enough to exile them. Their kettles were enormous. Their fires ran for days. They stirred with long-handled paddles and kept their recipes secret, even though the ingredients were no secret at all. There was a kind of reverence around them, not admiration, but wary tolerance, like you might show to a person who knew how to handle poison without dying. And for many, that's exactly what soap was. Not in the way we think of poison today, but in the way people feared things they couldn't control. Soap changed things. It changed how clothes felt, how skin felt, how people smelled. It erased. And erasure, in a world so built on lineage and labor, was frightening. What would happen, some wondered, if a washerwoman scrubbed away more than just dirt? What if scent was meant to linger for a reason? What if God gave us oil and sweat to remind us of humility? And what kind of person wanted to strip it away? These weren't just idle questions. They were real fears. There were stories, half remembered, often whispered, of soap causing rashes that festered, of hands raw and bloodied from washing, of children who fell ill after their mothers rinsed their clothes too well. Soap to them was not neutral. It was a tool, and tools, when misused, could turn. Yet despite this, soap persisted, not because it was loved, but because it worked. When used with caution, it softened the grip of grease on pans, lifted stains from tunics, scrubbed the worst of harvest from a man's boots. It was kept in the laundry room, not the kitchen, in the tool chest, not the wardrobe. You didn't display it. You hid it, and most people didn't use it on their skin. That was for special occasions, a birth, a burial, a marriage. Soap might touch your body too, maybe 3 times a year. And when it did, it stung, it clung, It left you pink and raw, like new bark under peeled wood. You didn't use it to smell nice. You used it to prove you were clean. There were different kinds, of course. In the South, in warmer climates, people made a softer version. Olive oil soaked, gentler, greener, scented with laurel or herbs. It was prized by the wealthy, imported at great cost. But for most, especially in northern villages, soap remained what it had always been. Rough, gritty, homemade in pots, scraped into chunks and used until it vanished. And in that small lump of brown hardness was a world of contradiction, cleansing but feared, necessary but distrusted, kept close but never praised. It wasn't until centuries later that soap became soft and scented and sold in wrappers. But in Avon 50, if someone handed you a bar of it, you used it not with delight, but with caution. Because even then, something in you remembered that anything strong enough to clean the world might also be strong enough to change it. No one made soap by accident. It was a task that required precision, patience, and a tolerance for mess, both physical and moral. You began with ashes, sifted and sorted from a hearth that had burned hardwood. Ashes from softer woods, like willow or poplar, were no good. They left too little lie. Oak, ash, beech, these were best. The whiter the ash, the more potent the result. You poured water over them, let it sit, drained it slowly through a straw-filled filter or linen cloth, and caught the liquid as it seeped out. This was your lie, and it was dangerous. It could burn through a boot if spilled, blind a goat if splashed. It was known to peel the hide off a rabbit in seconds. Stories of such things passed from washer to washer with solemn nods and sour expressions. But it worked. It dissolved things, and that power was worth the risk. Then came the fat. Not the rich golden stuff scraped from roasting pans, but the heavy white lumps collected from slaughter, rendered down from sheep, goats, or cows, cooled and stored in cellars in waxed pots that smelled like old breath. It was never fresh. It had to sour a little, grow soft and strange, almost rank. Only then could it be melted again, mixed with lye. Stirred until the whole thing thickened into a paste that looked more like porridge than purification. Sometimes herbs were added, sometimes chalk or salt. Soap made without additives worked well enough, but it smelled worse and clung to the hands like wax. Better soap, the kind traded in marketplaces or offered to monasteries, was firmer, crumbled less, and left a cleaner squeak behind. But it was rare and expensive, so most people used what they had, which meant that every village had one woman, or perhaps one man, though less often, who knew how to make it. She was not celebrated. She was tolerated. You didn't invite her to baptisms, but you sent your linen to her when the baby was born. You kept her at the edge of the feast table, but you asked her advice when the child's tunic refused to come clean after a nosebleed. Her house always smelled faintly burnt. The pot never came fully clean. Her arms were stronger than they looked, and her hands bore the stains of a dozen cauldrons worth of lye. She might sell a bar for a coin, or trade it for eggs, or simply set it out in slabs and let the neighbors come by with quiet gratitude. No one praised her, but everyone used what she made, and no one dared ask her to explain how it worked, because to mix ash and fat into something that could clean, well, that was close to magic, and magic was never far from heresy. The church didn't outright ban soap, but it didn't bless it either. Priests rarely spoke of it. It was too bodily, too earthy, too close to the business of touch and need. A man might wash his hands before Mass, yes, but to speak openly of scrubbing feet or boiling oils or rubbing soap against bare skin, that was veering into dangerous territory, especially if you were a woman, especially if you were good at it. So soap remained quiet. It sat in the corner of the laundry. It waited in dark cellars, stacked in crumbling towers, wrapped in cloths to keep the mice off. It was brought out only when needed, when a hem turned stiff, when a child had fever sweat, when a man died and the shroud had to be worthy of burial. People used it like a secret, and sometimes they used it with shame. There were murmurs in certain households that soap, though effective, was a temptation. That to clean too deeply was to show pride. That to enjoy the feeling of one's skin after washing was to invite sin. Not everyone believed it, but enough did to make soap a kind of quiet confession. To use it was to admit that the body mattered, that it deserved comfort, and comfort was always suspect. Still, some clung to it. A washerwoman with cracked hands and a sharp tongue. A monk who kept a single bar wrapped in waxed cloth beside his writing desk. A merchant's wife who scrubbed her neckline with soap before every feast, though no one ever saw her do it. They weren't proud of it. They were practical. Soap didn't make you holy, but it made you bearable. To yourself and to others. And in a world where water was feared and scent was managed, and the body was rarely allowed to be soft, that was enough. By the time the soap reached your hands, it had already passed through fire, grief, and hard decisions. Someone had scraped fat from the bones of animals they once fed through a hard winter. Someone had burned wood carefully, saving the white ash from the base of the hearth, while others complained of cold. Someone had stirred a pot for hours, watching the bubbles form and fade, hoping it wouldn't curdle, hoping it wouldn't crack. And when it was finished, when the thick paste had hardened, when the cauldron had been scraped and cooled, when the ash had cooled and the lye jars sealed, someone had cut it into blocks and waited for someone else to knead it. But even then, even after all that work, soap didn't command reverence. It was used, not admired. Scraped against dirty tunics, melted into boiling pots, grated into slop, and rubbed against linen until the fibers strained. No one thanked the soap. No one wondered what it meant. But in its own quiet way, soap was a threshold, a line between life, lived inside the dirt, and life, however briefly, lived just beyond it. The strange thing was, it didn't always work the way people wanted. Soap in 1150 wasn't consistent. Sometimes it hardened properly. Sometimes it stayed soft, melting in your hand like tallow. Sometimes it was too strong and burned the skin. Other times it crumbled, leaving behind nothing but grit. You learned through trial, through error, through ruined cloth and blistered palms. No one taught you how. You watched, you guessed, but even when it didn't work, it was still used, because something in the act mattered. The doing of it, the scrubbing, the rinsing, the moment your fingers ached not just from work, but from trying to make something less filthy. It wasn't about purity, not really. It was about effort, about standing in a cold room, stirring a gray pot, soaking your sleeves, and deciding, despite everything, that you would not leave things as they were. And that was enough to make soap strange, powerful, uncomfortable. The people who used it most were the ones furthest from power. Washerwomen, midwives, or laundresses, monks who had taken vows of silence, soldiers preparing for burial. No one in a position of ease ever made soap with their own hands. They might commission it. They might import it. They might speak of it lightly. But they did not boil it. They did not bleed from it. And maybe that was why it was feared. Because the people who made it knew something the rest did not. They knew what it took to strip a tunic of death. What it meant to rinse a cloth used in childbirth and see the water turn red. What it felt like to clean something not because it made you feel good, but because it made the world less heavy. They weren't saints. They weren't alchemists. They were just people with cracked hands and ash behind their teeth. And they made something that didn't lie. You couldn't hide from soap. You couldn't talk your way around it. It worked, or it didn't. It burned, or it saved. It left the cloth stiff with hope, or soft with failure. It told you who you were in a way no priest ever could. And that truth lingered, not in the scent, but in the silence. Because for all the murmurs, all the warnings, all the fear, it remained. A block of brown grit in the corner of the washing room, waiting to be used again. Not to bless, not to cure, but to remind you that the world, for all its filth and ache, still gave you a way to touch it and try. And so, the bathhouse empties. The steam fades. The rush of water becomes memory. All that's left are worn wooden tubs, the silence of stone, and the faint trace of rosemary on a damp cloth. As the echoes of that world slip away, one truth lingers, a soft reminder that even in centuries of grime and hardship, people still longed for warmth, for cleansing, for the smallest relief from the weight of their days. And now, there are no more stories to follow tonight. Only the hush of history and your own peaceful breath. Let the world fade away. May you find calm, and may your dreams be gentle and deep.